Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. Today is the 9th hearing that we've held on comprehensive tax reform, not counting the roundtable discussion held by the Joint Committee on Taxation, where we were joined by key architects of the Tax Reform Act of 1986. During our very first hearing of the year, which was also our first hearing on tax reform, we discussed the need to transform our tax code so that it would encourage rather than inhibit job creation. 6 months later, as we continue to struggle in an economy where unemployment remains high and growth is virtually stagnant, the need to overhaul Americans' broken tax code has never been greater. Clearly, the tax code is too complex, too costly, and takes too much time to comply with. All this adds more burdens on families and employers, making it more difficult to create the jobs that 14 million men and women in this country need. Since the beginning of our discussions on comprehensive tax reform, I have cited three things I'm certain of as we take on this endeavor. First, I have no illusions that this will be an easy task, but then most things that are worth doing never are. Second, I don't think this should be a partisan exercise. And third, and most importantly, we will talk to the American people, individuals, families, employers, both large and small, who are actually affected by the laws we pass here in Washington. They are the real experts, and that's why their voices are critical as we explore and develop tax reform policy. That brings us to why we're here today. Although our current tax system does include some elements that are consumption-based, such as excise taxes, for the most part, our tax code is thought of as being based on the taxation of income. To this point, our hearings this year, including the joint hearing we held with the Senate Finance Committee 2 weeks ago, explored tax reform with an eye toward maintaining an income-focused tax base. We've explored how the current tax system works and in many cases doesn't work for employers and families. Today, we're shifting gears just a bit to explore a different basis for taxation, consumption. We will examine two different consumption tax models that have emerged as potential alternatives to our current income tax system, the fair tax and the value-added tax. Our first panel will discuss the policy arguments for and against adopting the fair tax as a replacement for existing federal taxes. Our second panel will examine the advantages and disadvantages of a value-added tax, or VAT, whether as a supplement to or full replacement for existing taxes. We have some terrific witnesses on our panels, and I'd like to thank them for being here today. We are anxious to hear from them and look forward to engaging in discussion. And with that, I will yield to Ranking Member Levin for the purposes of his opening statement.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to join in welcoming this panel in the second. You are very active and distinguished people, and if I might say a special hello to Mr. Huckabee, the Honorable Huckabee. It says H-O-N in front of your name, and we're glad to see you. This hearing may take on a number of sparks in view of the crisis that we face today, but I don't want anyone to feel that we anything but welcome all of you here today. Yesterday, the Speaker put forward what he calls a two-step approach, and I quote, to hold President Obama accountable, end of quotes. Under that proposal, the Speaker states that there will be, and I quote, no tax hikes. But what would the proposals before us today mean for millions of working American families? A tax hike. At the same time, the Speaker's proposal establishes a commission that cannot recommend reducing the deficit by ending tax breaks for people making over $1 million a year, or ending tax loopholes that encourage companies to ship jobs overseas, or shutting down tax havens. This prohibition on a commission even considering revenues, along with the spending caps in the Speaker's proposal, would mean major cuts in vital programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So, today, while our nation is facing a severe crisis, the majority is holding this hearing on proposals that do not address this immediate crisis and would raise taxes for millions of middle and low-income families at the same time that they are insisting on a deficit package that protects tax breaks for very wealthy households. What we must focus on right now, and I emphasize this, is avoiding a default that would risk another financial crisis and millions of jobs. It could delay the Social Security checks that millions of seniors depend on. It could permanently call into question the full faith and credit of the U.S. and make it even more difficult to reduce the deficit. Our President has called again and again for a balanced approach to getting a handle on our nation's debt. This committee has jurisdiction over many of the elements of such an approach. It is the committee in the House with jurisdiction over legislation on the debt ceiling. We on this committee have a solemn obligation to step up to the plate and address the matter at hand, avoiding a default and finding a balanced approach to deficit reduction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Levin. Today we will hear from two distinguished panels of witnesses. Our witnesses bring a wealth of knowledge with combined experience in government, academia, and the private sector. Our first panel includes 4 experts on the fair tax embodied this Congress in H.R. 25 as introduced by Representative Rob Woodall. Our second panel will include 6 experts on value-added taxes. We begin with our fair tax experts. First, I would like to welcome the Honorable Mike Huckabee. From 1996 until 2007, Governor Huckabee served as the 44th Governor of Arkansas. He ran for the Republican nomination for President in 2008 and currently is the host of the television show Huckabee and the radio program The Huckabee Report. Governor, we extend a warm welcome to you and look forward to your testimony. Next, we will hear from Lawrence Kotlikoff. Mr. Kotlikoff is a professor of economics at Boston University. He has authored or co-authored 14 different books and from 1981 to 1982 served as a senior economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Mr. Kotlikoff is accompanied this morning by Mr. David Tierk. Mr. Tierk is a professor and chairman of the Department of Economics at Suffolk University in Boston, Massachusetts. He is also the chairman of the Beacon Hill Institute, a research center that develops and performs economic and statistical analysis of current and emerging public policy issues. And finally, we welcome Mr. Bruce Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett has served as the staff director of the Joint Economic Committee, as a senior policy advisor for President Reagan, and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department. Mr. Bartlett is currently a columnist for Tax Notes and the Fiscal Times and also contributes to the New York Times economics blog. Thank you all again for being with us today. The committee has received each of your written statements and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks, and Governor Huckabee will begin with you. Welcome again, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Camp and Ranking Member Levin, members of the committee, it's an honor and privilege to be able to be with you today to talk about the fair tax. Let me just begin with a personal observation. Having raised 3 children, all of whom are now adults, and when they moved out, my wife and I ended up with 3 dogs. My kids think we replaced them with the dogs. They also think we treat the dogs better than we ever treated them. I tell them it's because the dogs behave better than the kids ever did. But I learned something about behavior, both from raising children and training dogs. And the basic premise is this: if you want a certain behavior, you reward it and you'll get more of it. And if you want to stop a certain behavior, you consequence it and you get less of it. It's a principle of life that we all understand. The fair tax is based on the simple idea that we ought to reward good economic behavior and we should not reward irresponsible and reckless economic behavior. The sort of behaviors that will create a stronger economy, grow jobs, make it possible for people to be independent, is that we reward them for their work, we reward them for their investments, their risk-taking, we reward them for saving something, because that puts something aside for those unexpected moments in life so that they won't be dependent upon somebody else's charity. They'll be dependent upon their own thoughtfulness in preparing for the unforeseen circumstances that, frankly, all of us have experienced. The fair tax doesn't punish people for their productivity, and it does not reward them for their irresponsibility. And that's the essence of it. Must be honest with you, I didn't know what the fair tax was. When I was campaigning 4 years ago, people would come up to me and say, do you believe in the fair tax? I said, well, of course I believe that taxes ought to be fair. They said, no, the fair tax. And I had no idea what they were talking about. Somebody finally handed me a book and the bill, the fair tax bill. I read it, made too much sense. So I read it again. And then I met with a group of economists to ask them and to spend several hours peppering them with questions about how it would functionally work. And I came away as a strong proponent. And I wish I could take credit for some of the creation, but I'm not the chemist that designed it. I'm just the pharmacist that's trying to dispense it. And so today I come with a sense of recognizing that the fair tax is in fact a transformational approach to the government getting revenue. It's revenue neutral as it's designed. It's not intended to raise taxes or lower taxes. It's, I believe, an approach that could be equally embraced by Democrats and Republicans because it accomplishes something both want to do. It helps people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum because of a unique feature that is often overlooked or misunderstood called the prebate, and it's fundamental to its effectiveness. But it also makes it possible to bring manufacturing jobs and other types of economic models back to the United States from its offshore infusion because of the fact that people are not going to be punished for actually producing. There's so many things that I'd like to present, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to look at some of the written testimony. But the fair tax, in many ways, I want to contend, works because of its fundamental idea that it is flat. It's based on the consumption of things purchased at the retail level. It's fair because it does not adjust itself to any particular demographic group. It's finite because it's a fixed rate with total transparency, which is one of the things that I find most appealing about it. There is an absolute transparency about what people would pay, and it's family friendly, and it doesn't penalize marriage or raising children, as sometimes the tax code does. I think it's clear to say that there are very few people, if anyone, in the entire country who understands the 67,000 pages of the tax code. It's extraordinarily convoluted. It's so convoluted that for the most part, the reason that there are 35,000 lobbyists in this city are to influence the tax code so that there can be winners and losers. What I would like to suggest is that the fair tax means that every American, in essence, becomes his or her own lobbyist because there is no need to always be manipulating the tax code to create special favors for one against another. All of us who've watched sporting events know this one thing, that the guys in the striped shirts are not there to determine the outcome of the game. They're just there to make sure that the game is played fairly. When the guys in the striped shirts start determining the outcome of the game, we no longer respect them. The purpose, I believe, of the tax system is not to determine the outcome of the game, but to make sure that there is a fair and absolutely objective playing field, and that's what the fair tax does. And I come today with over 75,000 online signatures of people who just in the past 3 or 4 days have urged me to appeal to you to give consideration to it, notwithstanding any political or partisan consideration. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you very much, Governor. Mr. Kotlikoff and Mr. Tierk, you each have 5 minutes. You together have 5 minutes, and you are recognized now. Thank you. Your written statements are part of the record.
Thank you, Chairman Camp and Ranking Member Levin, and members of the committee. We're honored by this invitation to testify today about the fair tax. This is one of several different ways we could implement consumption taxation. We think the fair tax has a number of reasons to recommend it over the other alternatives. I want to talk to you about that. I myself have an alternative to the fair tax, which is called the purple tax, which I put forth recently. But today I'm here to talk about the fair tax together with my co-author, David Turk. So the fair tax would replace the personal income tax, the federal personal income tax, and the federal corporate income tax, and the estate and gift tax with a federal retail sales tax that would tax all consumption goods and services, with the exception of imputed rent on existing houses, at a 23% effective rate, a 30% nominal rate. And it would have, as Governor Huckabee indicated, there would be a demo grant to make that tax progressive. But I want to point out that as an economist, my profession doesn't believe that a consumption tax is regressive. I know that a number of you folks do believe that a consumption tax is regressive, even without for leaving aside the issue of the rebate or the prebate. A number of you believe that a consumption tax is regressive. We economists don't believe you're right. We think you're looking at it the wrong way. We think you're measuring progressivity the wrong way. We think when you look at it correctly and measure progressivity against lifetime resources, you think about lifetime tax burdens as a share of lifetime resources, you'll see that a consumption tax is actually more progressive than you think. Now, what is a consumption tax actually? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, not just about the progressivity, but what actually it's taxing. A consumption tax is really taxing what's used to pay for consumption. And what's used to pay for consumption are two things: wealth and wages, not just your current wages, but also your future wages. So your consumption over your lifetime is being financed, being paid for by your taxes on your wealth, by your wealth and your wages. So if you tax your consumption, you're in effect taxing what's used to pay for your consumption. So economists believe, and this is just mathematically the case, it's not really a belief, it's just a mathematical proposition, that a tax on wealth plus a tax on wages is equivalent to a tax on consumption. So if you're an advocate of taxing wealth and using the proceeds from taxing wealth to lower the tax rate on workers, and I think a lot of Democrats would say that sounds very progressive to me, taxing wealth, using the revenues to lower the tax rate on wages, then you have to be, logically speaking, a proponent of the consumption tax, because that's what a consumption tax does. It taxes wealth and it uses the revenues to lower the tax on workers, on wages. Now, a fair tax, consumption tax also, compared to an existing income tax, is much more favorable towards saving, and insofar as it doesn't prejudice you towards consuming in the present relative to the future. That's what an income tax does. If you look at this chart in my testimony, joined with David, you'll see that the national saving rate last year was exactly 0, except for a decimal place. It was 0.1% last year. That's our national saving rate last year. Our domestic investment rate was 4.4%. So we're not saving as a nation. We're saving nothing as a nation. We're investing next to nothing. We need to have a tax system that gives people incentives to save, and also puts the burden on people fairly so that we get equity as well as the right incentives. So that's a couple of points, that what exactly the fair tax taxes and its incentives. The other thing is that we have in this testimony is a table on we have two tables, one on effective tax rates, which show that the effective tax rates, marginal effective tax rates, are much lower under the fair tax than under the existing tax structure, and that there's also a table showing you lifetime progressivity, and we show in this table that the fair tax on a lifetime tax basis is actually more progressive than the existing tax system, basically because it does do this thing that I mentioned, which is tax wealth and use the proceeds to lower the tax on wages. Let me now turn the time over to David that I took away from him. Sorry.
Well, I'll make an exception, Mr. Chair. I'll give you a minute to sum up.
Well, thank you. All economics professors are long-winded, and I'm no exception. I think that Larry covered the main points about the issue of regressivity versus progressivity. He's right. No modern economist believes any longer that consumption taxes are regressive, something for the analysts in Washington to start thinking about. I'm simply going to draw attention to one of the tables in our combined testimony that relates to the effect of the fair tax on investment. Economic theory tells us that consumption taxes untax net investment. That should be intuitively obvious because of the fact that the corporate income tax goes away. So lots of us have done estimates on this. I will tell you something about our estimates. We show that in the first year of implementation, real GDP would go up by about 8%. Domestic investment would go up by a whopping 75%. Employment by 12%. Real wages by 10%. And eventually consumption would go up too by about 6%. These are numbers on which there is widespread agreement by people who have modeled this issue, and it should be no surprise. You untax investment, you get more investment, you get more investment, you get more growth. Thank you. And I thank you, the committee, too, for inviting me.
All right, thank you. Thank you both. Mr. Bartlett, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If you could push the button on your microphone at the bottom.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say that I do support, in principle, the concept of a consumption-based tax system. But I think that many economists, perhaps including those to my right, gloss over the critical administrative aspects of consumption taxes. And they want to take all of the benefits that you would get from any consumption-based tax system and attribute them exclusively to the fair tax, which I think is wrong. My main objection to the fair tax has always been one simple thing: it simply won't work. It is ridiculously pie-in-the-sky proposal. Let me point to a couple of things. It would abolish the Internal Revenue Service and all of the collection machinery that has been built up over the last 100 years for collecting taxes, and force the states to collect the federal government's revenues for this. Now, this strikes me as unconstitutional, but I don't want to argue that point. The main thing is that it won't work. We tried this during the Articles of Confederation, and we ended up with the Constitution. Secondly, the tax would apply to all governments. State and local governments would have to pay the tax to the federal government, as well as collecting the tax for the federal government. This makes no sense. The federal government would have to pay the tax to itself. The cost of every single thing the federal government buys will be 30% higher. But the proponents somehow or other assume that federal spending is fixed in nominal terms, so you get a huge cut in spending that helps finance this whole operation. Third, housing. If you buy a new house, you're going to have to pay 30% more. But if you buy a used house, you don't have to pay anything. This strikes me as administratively impossible, whatever its virtues may be. The problem of evasion is always glossed over. The reason why, I mean, we all know we have a very serious evasion problem right now when we have a huge amount of taxes withheld from people's paychecks and so on. But under the fair tax, you would eliminate all of that machinery. You would collect taxes at exactly one point in the entire economic system at the retail outlet. There is too much incentive for people to go to the wholesale level and buy out of the factory door. The retail store owner has just as much incentive to evade the tax as the buyer. They just do their purchases off the books. The idea of collecting, having a national retail sales tax has been studied by other countries. They always rejected it because there would be too high a degree of evasion. Instead, they have all favored the value-added tax, which is a form of consumption tax that will work. We know it works because every other country except us has one. And it's basically, it was designed to deal with all of the administrative and evasion problems that are inherent in the nature of a retail sales tax. Finally, I want to mention something about the rebate, which the supporters say is necessary to offset the regressivity of the tax. But this would be, as the George W. Bush administration's tax reform report pointed out, this would involve the creation of the largest entitlement program in the history of the United States. They estimated that its cost would be $800 billion per year in 2005 dollars. And these checks would go out to people with Social Security numbers on a monthly basis. Now, this committee knows perfectly well we have a huge problem, people with fake Social Security numbers now. Can you imagine what it will be like if by getting a fake Social Security number, you can get monthly checks from the government, large checks too? This is just a license for abuse waiting to happen. A couple of technical points. Getting rid of the corporate income tax may sound very good to the corporate community, but what's going to happen to all their unused depreciation the day the corporate income tax disappears? They have nothing to deduct it against, and if you think this isn't a problem, it is. When Professor Kotlikoff talks about taxing wealth, you have to understand that the people whose wealth would essentially be taxed by this proposal are the elderly. They saved all during their lifetimes when there was no broad-based consumption tax, and in retirement, they had this anticipation that they would be able to withdraw that saving tax-free. But in fact, they will have to pay a 30% tax on everything at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Governor Huckabee, as you know, our nation's unemployment is unacceptably high. And how would the fair tax, if we adopted that, how would that bring about more jobs in this country?
Well, Congressman, one of the ways that it'll happen, manufacturing has moved offshore in large measure because corporations are having a difficult time and job creators have a difficult time when they're competing with countries with a lower tax rate. If our tax rate is 0 and there's no tax assessed at the production level, then it's obvious that we then become more competitive. If we have a 0 capital gains tax, capital not only that has been parked offshore, and it's been estimated that there is as much as $14 trillion of U.S. money, that's as much as the debt, 14 trillion parked offshore to protect it from the tax code, legally and legitimately. But what would happen if that money came back to the United States because there was no penalty for parking it here? That would certainly be a far better situation. Let me, if I could very quickly give this anecdotal mention, because it was one of the things that sold me on the fair tax. I was in New Hampshire 4 years ago and visiting with a gentleman who was working at a machine shop, working 2 shifts, because he wanted to help his daughter through grad school at Cornell. And he said that was costing $53,000 a year, which caused me to gasp. But he said, this is a guy with a high school education, working 2 shifts. He said, when he took on the second shift, he thought he would make twice as much money. But as it turned out, it put him in a different tax bracket, and a lot of what he was making in the second shift was going to taxes, not to his daughter. He said, I don't understand this. And the honest answer is, neither do I. Why should you punish a person who's working twice as hard? Truth is, if he quit both jobs, then his daughter would qualify for some assistance that he and her would not qualify for under the current tax code. I think for most of us, regardless of our political persuasion, that seems insane.
I have a question for both you and Mr. Kotlikoff. Different states have different laws and rules. For example, in Michigan, my home state, there is a sales tax, but the sales tax doesn't apply to groceries, for example. Under the fair tax, groceries are not exempt. How would that impact stores in Michigan? And if they don't currently collect sales taxes, would they now be required to do that? And would there be any transition rules or similar relief available to help sort of ease the administrative burden on those businesses and employers? And either one of you can answer. If Mr. Kotlikoff, you want to go first?
Yeah, they would be required to collect the tax at the store. Whether there was some transition relief would be up to you folks to provide if you felt it was necessary. But let's think about the people coming into the store to actually buy these consumption goods, the food, the bread, eggs. Well, they're going to get if they're working, they're going to get a paycheck that has no income tax withheld from it. And there's also going to be no FICA tax withheld. So they're going to have more wherewithal, and they're also going to get a monthly rebate check. We are sending out lots of checks to lots of people, older retirees, through Social Security, Bruce, and we do have some fraud, I'm sure, but I don't think it's a reason to eliminate Social Security, for example. So just to answer back to your question, I think it's not going to be all the prices of all the goods and services are going to uniformly go up because of this. People are still going to need to buy groceries, and I think that store will still be able to function.
But you envision the collection point being at the grocery store?
At the store, yeah. We're going to go from about 120, with the fair tax, one would go from about 120 million paying entities to about 700,000. So that's really relevant to the issue of enforcement and evasion. If you have an entire IRS, I'm not particularly so keen on abolishing the IRS. I think we have a lot of people there that could be used to enforce the fair tax, if that's what you folks implement. So if you go to 700,000 rather than 120 million tax returns, you have a lot more ability to enforce the tax collection because you have fewer taxpayers.
Okay, Governor.
Congressman, if I could address the administrative issue. As a governor for 10.5 years, I mean, we certainly understand how to collect taxes. But the reality is that every business owner who's collecting taxes has that set up electronically, and it's programmed in. And the idea that this is going to be a monstrous task is simply not the case. This is not mom and pop jotting down on a pad. This is a computer program that easily can be programmed, and the states and localities would be getting basis points for their collection, so they're going to get, in essence, a cash windfall as a result of their part of the collection process. And that will make it more attractive to them because they're not doing it without some compensation for their administrative efforts.
All right, thank you. Mr. Levin is recognized.
Well, this is called a fair tax. By the way, Social Security, people worked for their Social Security. It's not a handout from the government. But I want to get to one of the basic issues here relating to the so-called fair tax. And Mr. Bartlett, I read from your special report dated December 24, 2007 on why the fair tax won't work. And I just want to get to this issue of regressivity. So I'm just reading from this tax report of yours. But what if the worker is now paying less than 23% of his income in federal taxes? In this case, he is clearly worse off. The prices of the things he buys will rise by more than his income rises from the elimination of income and payroll taxes. Conversely, if one is wealthy and in a tax bracket above 23%, that person would be much better off. His income and payroll taxes would fall by much more than the prices of goods and services he consumes would rise. I want to ask you about this because here we're in this battle over raising the debt ceiling. And the majority position in the House is no taxes, that you can't touch the tax rates for people who are making over $1 million. This is annual income of $250,000. Most of that is income over $1 million. So just reading this analysis of yours, it seems to me that it's clear that for people who already are doing very, very well, in most cases, this helps them. Well, for middle-income taxpayers who would not receive a check in most cases from the government, this would mean an increase in their taxes. I don't see how you escape this, and therefore I think it is absolutely, what should I say, inappropriate, to be charitable, to call this a fair taxation proposal. Could you comment on that?
Let me make a point that is very seldom discussed by fair tax supporters, although Professor Kotlikoff alluded to it. If you impose a sales tax, if the Federal Reserve accommodates this tax, then the price level is going to rise by the amount of the tax. If it's a 23% or 30% sales tax, the price of every single consumption good is going to rise by 30%. So while it's true you will have more cash income because you no longer have to pay income and payroll taxes, the cost of everything you buy is going to cost more. That's where the burden of the tax comes from. Now, alternatively, if you assume that the Federal Reserve will not accommodate this 1-year inflation rate that would be the highest in our history, then real wages have to fall, because they always make the argument that the prices of goods will fall by enough to compensate for the tax. They basically make two simultaneous and contrary arguments. The prices will fall, but then they will rise. But if you assume a fixed price level, then wages have to fall, so otherwise producers will not be able to reduce their prices. Their costs have to be lower.
So who bears the burden of this? From your analysis, the very wealthy, more or less, in most cases, are helped, while many, mostly middle-income tax brackets are hurt. Isn't that correct?
The burden is borne by consumption, and so it depends on what your consumption is relative to your income. People with low incomes consume virtually all of their income. People in the middle brackets save some, that would not be taxed. People in the upper brackets save almost all of their income. So it would be proportional to your consumption.
Yeah, so I think this is an unfair tax proposal. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, welcome. Governor, as you well know, there's been a lot of debate when it comes to the real fair tax rate, and Mr. Bartlett argues the true rate's not really 23%, but 30%. How would you answer that charge on the true rate?
Well, I think the economists are probably better equipped to get into the specifics. They're trained for that, but I would say that one of the things that's being missed is that there is an embedded tax in everything that we purchase that's hidden. It's estimated to be approximately 22% of everything that we buy, because if we buy a loaf of bread, the taxes that were built into the people who planted the wheat, harvested the wheat, manufactured the process, delivered it, all the taxes that go into the process are hidden. And the consumer doesn't know that that tax is embedded. When that tax is taken out of the process and it's paid at the consumption level, you already have a dramatically different situation in terms of the price of the goods that will likely go down. Plus, when the consumer goes to purchase that item, the consumer is going with his or her entire paycheck. Most Americans have never gone to the marketplace with their entire paycheck. Their paycheck has all the extractions from the federal government, and they never see what their paycheck is. But the other thing, it provides a more stable funding for Social Security, because it's based on the consumption that all of us make, not just the wages that wage earners are making, which is, I think, another good reason for the fair tax to be a strong consideration.
Mr. Bartlett, you care to respond?
Well, it's very confusing. So if you just eliminated all existing federal taxation and it just disappeared forever, then clearly all prices and wages would eventually fall by the amount of the tax, and you'd be better off. But if you then put the tax back on in a different form, then the prices go back up again. So at times, the fair tax people make it sound like it's all a wash. Okay, you take out the income taxes, prices fall by 23%. You put a 23% tax on, then everything is exactly the way it is right now. No change in the price level. But if that's true, there's no need for the rebate, because there's no regressivity to offset. Everything has been a wash. You get more take-home pay. You pay a little bit more at the of exactly the amount that's now being withheld for the goods and services you buy. You're no worse off. So there's no need for the rebate because there's no regressivity. And the truth is that obviously there is regressivity. You can't have a consumption-based tax system without it. And whether having some kind of monthly check that goes to every person in the United States is the way to deal with that is a debatable point.
Well, you stated in your testimony that given that tax revenues have averaged around 18% of GDP since World War II, what, in your view, would the fair tax rate have to be to generate that level of revenue?
I honestly don't know for this reason. For as long as I've heard of the fair tax, which is more than 20 years, they have always said that a rate of 23% would equal current revenues and not increase them and not reduce them. But during that time period, revenues have been as high as 20.6% of GDP in the year 2000, and right now they're about 14.8% of GDP. So if it would equal revenues in 2000 at 23%, then it would have to be a massive tax increase today. Either that, or it never would come anywhere close to have equaled the revenues that we had in the year 2000. If they were honest, the rate would vary depending on taxes as a share of GDP, but they always say year after year, it's always 23%.
Governor and Professor, would you care to comment?
Yeah, I would. So first of all, let me say I'm not, the fair tax guys that Bruce is alluding to, well, I'm not one of them. I'm a professional economist, okay? And I'm here to talk to you folks as a professional economist, not as, quote, the fair tax guy, all right? Let's just start there. Now, a lot of the
So
things,
you don't want to pay a fair tax?
what? Well, I want to tell you what I know as an economist, okay?
Okay.
And a lot of the statements that have just been made would not get through my course that Bruce just made, and even a couple that Governor Huckabee made are not really appropriate about the fair tax, because we don't really think that the current tax system is embedded in prices. We don't think that current prices embed the current taxes. We do think that if you put on the fair tax, prices will go up. If the Fed accommodates, we think the Federal Reserve determines the price level. It does.
I'm gonna have to stop you here because the 5 minutes has expired. Mr. Rangel's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, experts, for sharing your views with us. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank Governor Huckabee. He was kind enough to invite me to his very popular TV show, and was more than fair to me in the differences that we had politically. And I really thought I had you when I gave you the scenario of a debate between how you protect the vulnerable. And I put on one side the naked and the thirsty and the hungry and those who were jobless, and wanted to protect these people. They were unemployed and they were poor. And then I put on the other side that we can kind of protect them a little better if we made an appeal to the very rich and kind of said, could you help us out a little bit to protect the vulnerable? And I really thought I had you, but you went to divinity school and you came up with some verses that I never heard of, where the rich were entitled to empower the whatever humanity, and that the poor was here to stay. Could you restate that? Because most of that was done when I was asked to leave the show.
Congressman, it is a pleasure to see you again. I hope you'll come back to the show. But in the meantime, let me just say that what I believe you're referencing is, my understanding of the Scripture is that, do we have an obligation to the poor? Absolutely. Should we reach out and help people and lift them up? Absolutely. One of my reasons for the advocacy for the fair tax is because I believe that ultimately it does more to give people the opportunity to rise above where they've come from. I did not grow up with a silver spoon. I grew up dirt poor, paid my own way through college, paid my way through graduate school, first male in my entire family lineage to graduate high school, much less go to college. I've lived the American dream, and I didn't live it by having all of the aspects of attempting to get to the next rung on the ladder pushed back by a tax system that punished me for trying to get to the next rung on the ladder. I feel a great sense of personal responsibility to help those who struggle and continue to feel strongly.
But
If I did not feel the tax system could be improved, I wouldn't be here today. But I believe this approach does, in fact, empower the people at the lowest
no, thank you,
part of the
Governor.
spectrum.
I am going to have to go back to the scriptures, because if the tax burden is what I'm talking about with the sick, the poor, and the lesser among us,
No, I
I
don't.
got a lot of relearning to do. Let me ask the fair tax people quickly. This rebate thing, does the rich get a rebate as well as the poor?
You want to go ahead? Yeah.
Everybody gets the rebate,
Period.
depending on the
Hey,
composition of
That's
their
good enough for
family.
me. How much would the rebate be called an entitlement program, or what name would you have? Just rebate?
I think rebate
Everybody
does
gets
just
some-
fine. It's no more an entitlement than existing. I'm sorry.
No, okay, that's good. And that would mean that, would the governors operate the rebate or the federal government?
Federal government.
And who would pay the people to operate this massive trillion-dollar rebate to everybody, including the rich? Who would pay that?
I would leave the IRS in place until we got everything working.
Okay, now how about those who would eliminate the IRS
Well, I think-
completely? Because that goes over big
I think
in
you
every
gotta,
community.
you know, if you start picking on every little detail of,
No, that's not a IRS is more than a detail in my
I agree,
community.
and I think it's, all right, it's more than a detail. I think abolishing the IRS is not a clever idea. And
Mr.
not something
Chart,
I
do you
support.
agree that we have to keep the IRS?
No, I don't agree that we have to keep it. Somebody has
Okay,
to
good.
send
I
out the
just
checks.
want to make certain I'm not the only guy out here. So with you, we'll have the IRS plus this massive program to give back money and not collect it, right? Right. That's okay.
I would have the IRS hand out, yeah, the rebate, exactly.
Oh, I see. They would be the giver and the taker.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are now.
Mr. Bartlett, one question I want to ask you, because when I saw your background, you worked for every Republican that I've ever served under, including my friend Jack Kemp and Reagan and Bush. And they gave tax cuts, and they said that these tax cuts paid for themselves and went beyond that and created jobs. And yet, when you look at the ledger, it seems as though the tax cuts that were given by President Bush and Reagan actually were part of the deficit and not the job creation. What were your observations?
And if you
in
could
your
just
writing?
answer briefly, because time's expired.
Well, I think the Reagan tax cut in 1981, which I had some personal involvement with, was exactly the right thing to do under those economic circumstances. But I think it's wrong to assume that just doing the same thing over and over again is you're going to get the same results. I think current economic circumstances, you would not get any economic benefits from any tax cut that I am aware of, because our fundamental problem is a lack of aggregate demand, and tax cuts are essentially passive.
All right, thank you. Mr. Teaberry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today on the fair tax. Professor, kind of expanding upon Mr. Rangel's questioning, can you envision, or how do you envision the federal government being involved, giving a little bit of time to respond to this in the manner of either sending out these rebates or some enforcement mechanism? Is it the IRS or is it something different? Either one of you, or both?
I envision the states doing, the federal government working with the states to collect the tax, and the federal government, whether it's through the IRS or some other agency, mailing the rebate checks or distributing those to all Americans. So Bill Gates is going to get the same size check as somebody with his size family, but the check is going to be big enough so that poor people won't have to pay any sales tax on net. That's very important. This is going to produce a zero net tax liability for poor people. That's one of the reasons why this is a progressive tax structure. There is a table 2 in this testimony that we have that shows very clearly that Congressman Levin's statements about progressivity are not correct. It shows a very clear table of progressivity. It shows that Mr. Bartlett's statements are not correct either about the progressivity of the system. Let me just say one thing about this which may get your attention. Suppose you have Warren Buffett here and he has $30 billion. Suppose that Mr. Rangel were sitting here in front of Mr. Buffett. Mr. Buffett has $30 billion, and you ask Mr. Buffett, Mr. Rangel, gee, Mr. Buffett, if you were to spend your $30 billion today on 30 billion steaks, maybe you could buy them at $1 a steak, how many steaks would you get? Mr. Buffett would say 30 billion steaks. Now, Mr. Buffett, what if you had to face the 30% retail sales tax? How many steaks would you get? Well, he'd do the calculation and find out he had got 23% fewer steaks. In effect, the sales tax taxes Mr. Buffett's wealth. That's why I keep saying that the sales tax is a tax partly on wealth and partly on wages. So are we taxing wealth right now under the current system? No. Mr. Buffett's wealth is not taxed. We don't tax principal. We tax the income from it if Mr. Buffett actually realizes his capital gains, which he probably doesn't. He probably borrows against it to do consumption. So do a lot of other rich people. So you have to realize that the rich aren't paying a lot of taxes in this system. You know that as well as I, Mr. Rangel. But if you can have a way to tax their wealth, and even if they don't spend their wealth today, whenever he does spend it, he's going to be facing this tax. In present value, he's going to be out 23% of his wages. That's why the effective tax rate is 23%. That's the rate we need to use to compare the current income tax with the fair tax, because it's an apples to apples comparison. That's why you want to look at the effective tax rate, not the nominal tax rate.
Let me try to take this back. The governor mentioned about the IRS and mentioned about mentioned the tax code and how lengthy it was. This obviously is very much simpler than our current system. Would you need the current bureaucracy that we have in place? Wouldn't you just need something much smaller, Professor?
We've done some estimates of the impact on administration of the system, and it's vastly more expensive to have the existing income tax system when you count all the compliance costs that taxpayers have to bear compared to the fair tax. The only reason the fair tax architects want the states to collect the money is because almost all states have a sales tax, and it would be a simple extension of that mechanism to collecting the fair tax and passing it on to the government. But on the other hand, it'd be perfectly okay, too, if the federal government could do it more efficiently. So I'm with Larry on that. Why not let them? Whoever can do it more efficiently, they should collect the tax. And I have to say one thing about Mr. Bartlett's comments. His analysis is a welter of confusion and mathematical error. There is no new burden on state and local governments. There is no burden on the federal government. There is no basis for the rebate in whatever happens to prices. The rebate is there to take this from a proportional tax to a progressive tax. In fact, there's so much that we could begin with here as a baseline that would eliminate this confused thinking, that would take us much further along toward getting to a good answer to this problem. And I would hope that there would be a future hearing sometime where your economists would look at the discussion that's gone back and forth between Mr. Bartlett and me and Larry on this, and start from a baseline where we have at least the basic algebra correct. Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Stark is recognized.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I guess I have my credentials. Somebody up down there said they were poor. I was too. As a youngster, I never slept alone until I was married, and that defines how the Stark family got along in the Deep Depression. The value-added tax, or fair tax, as you call it, I'd just like to talk a little bit about why I would oppose it. One, I would no longer be able to go to Europe and meet with American CPAs as they studied the value-added tax and complained about the complexities that it imposed on American companies. Those are nice trips and they're interesting. But I'd like to just talk about some of the issues that would affect the Uniform Commercial Code. Transfer of title. Where do you pay the tax then? When the title transfers or when you collect? How every lawyer who provides a service to a client would owe the tax at the time he provided the service or she provided the service, not at the time when they collected the money. So you would suddenly find an awful lot of our professionals, lawyers, dentists, others who may not collect in cash on the spot, suddenly owing tax immediately, yet not having collected the revenue to pay for it. So in dealing with the Uniform Commercial Code that we're used to in this country, bankers would have a problem getting title to goods to lend against. All of these things would have to be restructured for the value-added tax to work. And that's one of the problems that I see in providing this. I wanted to ask the chairman if, is this a provision that might be in your suggestions for tax reform? If maybe you don't know yet, but.
We're holding a number of hearings on tax reform, and
So this
one
is
of
just
them.
one of the things you're considering. Okay. So I don't know, I'd ask Mr. Bartlett, what would you have to do to accommodate all of the changes in the way we conduct business in this country if you had a fair tax or value-added tax?
Well, it would be extremely difficult, but presumably we can get some guidance from other countries as to how they operate, and I believe that Mr. White from the GAO may be able to talk about that. But let me make a point, a more general point, which is that one of the reasons why the fair tax is administratively difficult is because it will tax all services. Now, no state makes any effort to tax more than a tiny fraction of services because there's no tangible exchange, there's no good involved. So it's ridiculously simple to go to somebody who's doing some work for you, whether it's a lawyer or a doctor or somebody who's doing landscaping for you, and say, let's just do this off the books. I'll pay you cash, and there'll be nothing for Uncle Sam because there will be no records.
Well, it's also why that in Europe, where they have it, they talk about tax collection. In other words, if the tax collector doesn't find you, you don't pay. So the European tax collectors have to run around from door to door, see if you bought a new car, remodeled your house, and then levy a tax and extract it from you. Here we still, for the most part, have a voluntary tax system, and I think under a fair tax or a VAT, that would disappear and no longer. How many of you on the panel here have been paid for your research in the area of fair tax or value-added tax? Just two of you. Okay. Governor Huckabee, you didn't collect anything for all the good work you're doing?
I have received not a penny from anyone associated with the fair tax. It is simply a position I've taken out of my wonderful charity for the United States of America and my consideration for the fine members of Congress.
Well, I want to thank you particularly for your kind words about me some weeks ago. I hope they don't come back to haunt you, and thank the witnesses for participating today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was interesting hearing the scripture tossed around here earlier. Different people try to fit these perceptions into their sense of worldview. The thing I would remind everybody is we're told not to add to or take away from the word. And it reminds me of something the chairman likes to say is the tax code is 10 times bigger than the Bible with no good news. Which brings me to a question when we relate to this issue of process, the huge cost of tax compliance. And compliance in any tax system is going to be an issue because there are those who are going to attempt to comply with the plan in the most advantageous way to themselves, and then there are those who will simply try to skirt the system. And I guess the question I would like to start with Professor Kotlikoff is, because all systems have a certain amount of non-compliance, first, who is going to enforce the fair tax, and is this a job that current IRS employees might handle?
Well, I have nothing against the current IRS employees. I think they're pretty efficient. They come on the phone these days. Yeah, I mean, look, lots of the vast majority of the sales are going to be in places like Walmart's, where there's not going to be much issue of compliance. So then the question is, and you're reducing dramatically the number of taxpayers from like 120 million down to 700,000. So then the question is, how do you go after, deal with compliance, where somebody comes up to mow your lawn? You know, now that kind of issue rises under the income tax. These people that are selling services aren't reporting for cash, aren't reporting their income under the income tax. The question is whether the evasion will be worse, and whether the compliance, the cost of getting people to comply will be higher. We think the costs will be smaller. We think the evasion should be smaller because we're going to have more people to dedicate to a smaller number of taxpayers to to work on that problem. But there's also some new ways you can think about dealing with evasion. I mean, suppose you tell the homeowner who's getting his lawn mowed that, look, you're responsible for when you get your lawn mowed, you're supposed to get a receipt with a barcode, and the amount that you paid for the lawn, you're supposed to put that into the mailbox, and also the person who mows your lawn is supposed to put it in the mailbox, and so the IRS or whatever agency can then compare and make sure that...
Just as an aside, wouldn't that give us something similar to what we had to undo with the 1099 situation earlier?
Well, I don't know about the 1099 situation you're referring to, but I'm saying that
I'm referring to the buried in the health care bill was that all business transactions over $600 would require the filings of 1099s, which would have inundated the very retail outlets that we're talking about. And I'm not sharpshooting you with the question, but coming down to a deeper process issue, if we're going to, anytime we reduce complexity, we reduce cost of compliance because the overhead component is reduced net keeps money in the economy. But I'm just trying to understand how we would have a legitimate enforcement mechanism from a process standpoint. I'm an engineer, not a politician, and I'm interested in how the flow would work in order to cut that cost and give a reasonable return.
I mean, the stores, the retail outlets would be responsible for collecting the taxes and mailing it in. Now, again, most of this is going to be done by, most of the sales collection tax collection would be done by big outlets like Walmart's. So I think that's likely to be an easier collection process than we now have with millions and millions of taxpayers having to decide really what income taxes they want, what income they want to report under the income tax. It's pretty much a voluntary tax the way it's set up. Nobody's checking my expenses or income very carefully from one year to the next. I have to, the government's relying on me to be honest, basically, which I am.
Any of the other witnesses, like the Governor Huckabee?
Well, what I'd like to point out is that there is an extraordinary amount of underground economy that is currently not taxed. I doubt that many gamblers, prostitutes, pimps, and drug dealers are filling out 1040 forms and sending in their due tax. And so when you base taxation on retail consumption, people who purchase things in the marketplace, even if they are drug dealers, prostitutes, pimps, and others, are going to be paying the tax like the rest of us who honestly pay our taxes. Dishonest people are still going to be dishonest, but we have a greater level of mechanism of collecting tax than we do, and the compliance issue is a huge one. It's been estimated that as much as $500 billion a year is spent just complying with the tax code in this country. That's money that doesn't produce a thing except paperwork. And that's why I believe the fair tax brings simplicity to a system that is overwhelmingly complicated.
Great. Thank you all very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I appreciate any opportunity we have to discuss comprehensive tax reform. However, I must express my disappointment that we are not gathered here to discuss the most pressing issue of the day, the ongoing debt ceiling negotiation. What worries me even more is that House Republicans seem to be making a habit of this. Last week, House Republicans allowed FAA authorization to expire, freezing airport projects nationwide, sending hundreds and thousands of hard-working Americans home indefinitely. We're just days away from August 2nd, yet here we're talking about everything but the debt limit. Despite a struggling economy, there seems to be no sense of urgency to help get Americans back to work. Now, Mr. Bartlett, you've been around for a while. In two administrations, you're a very smart, gifted man. Could you tell us about the dangers of not raising the debt ceiling? What will it mean for workers and their families if we do not raise the debt ceiling?
Well, the worst case scenario, quite frankly, is that the financial markets will completely seize up the way they did when Lehman Brothers collapsed, except it'll be far worse because the U.S. Treasury, the market for U.S. Treasury securities is essentially the foundation upon which the entire world financial system rests, because it is the one asset that everybody has always believed has zero risk of default. Now, you introduce into that system the tiniest little risk of default, and all of a sudden you have enormous problems. And the ratings agencies have repeatedly said that our debt may be downgraded, and this sets in motion a number of forces, because there are certain banks that are only allowed to hold AAA rated debt. If it goes down to BB, they got to get rid of some things. There are many securities that use U.S. Treasuries as their backing. And so if the Treasury security falls in price, they have problems. It becomes a ripple effect that we may not know the full consequences of unless it happens. Everybody thought the fall of Lehman, certainly the Treasury and the Federal Reserve didn't think it was that big a deal. Otherwise, they would have bailed them out. They said, let it go, and we know what happened. The entire world financial market seized up. I think we could see something potentially worse if we allow a default to occur.
Well, thank you very much. Professor, you care to respond? You had your hand up.
Yes, I envision a meeting with the President and the Majority Leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the House in which they say we've come up with a way to raise more revenue, to increase the fairness of the tax system, and have spending cuts too. And if you wanted to come up with that plan, adopt the fair tax. If you impose the fair tax rate at the statutory rate that we have today, the government would bring in about $200 billion more than it's currently bringing in. That would be the new revenue. We'd create jobs, 10% growth in jobs, spur investment, and then we would have the revenue increases that the President wants, and could get the spending cuts that the Speaker of the House wants. So that's the way to solve the problem. We could end this whole discussion right now. I suggest that's the way we do it.
Well, let me just ask your partner, your friend here, who is assisting you, Ms. Curley.
I think I'm assisting him, actually.
Okay. If a family of 4 at the poverty level lost the benefit of the EITC and the child credit, had to pay 23% more for everything they purchased, would they really be better off?
That's addressed in Table 2, Congressman Lewis. And let me say, my sensibilities about the poor are, I think, identical to yours. I think if you spent time with me, you'd understand that I have the same views about.
Well, you know, there's some numbers came out today or maybe late last night that the gap is widening. The rich is getting richer and the poor is getting
I'm concerned about that, and I've written about that.
And what would the fair tax? What
well, the fair tax, you know, I've studied this carefully. I've included in a framework where the EITC, the child tax credits, all the provisions of the federal income tax are incorporated. Done the homework on this. It's in Table 2. If we look at the table, if we look at, let's say, a couple married couple earning $30,000, we look at, no, not Table 2, it's Table, sorry, yeah, just Table 2. Let's just grab that. I think here somewhere. So let's look at a family that's now middle-aged, $30,000. Their lifetime average tax rate under the current system is 15.3%. That incorporates the EITC and the child tax credit. Under the fair tax, it's 3.4%. So what I did is I looked at, I didn't know the answer before I did the calculation, just so you know, okay? I did get paid for the research, but I didn't know the answer, and the research is what the research showed. So I said, let's take this framework, which is a lifetime life cycle framework. Let's look at the taxes that this couple is going to pay every year for the rest of their life. Let's figure out, as a share of the present value of their remaining lifetime resources, the present value of their labor income and their initial wealth, what is their tax rate, their average tax rate under the current tax system, and then let's do it again under the fair tax. Turns out to be lower under the fair tax. It's lower so if you look at this table, if you look at the results in Table 2 of the testimony, you'll see that this is actually a highly progressive tax. And it does lower the taxes on working people because it's coming up with another source of revenue, which is Warren Buffett's steak dinners. That's what I'm trying to get across here. This is embedding a wealth tax. If you Democrats really want to, if I came to you and said, you Democrats here on this panel, how would you feel about having a 23% effective tax on wealth and use the proceeds, a one-time tax on all the wealthy people in this country, use the proceeds to lower the taxes on workers. You'd say, that's fantastic, it'll never get through, no Republican would ever propose it. Well, that's what Republicans are proposing in the fair tax. That's mathematically, you take any first-rate economist from any top department, sit him here, ask him that question, and he'll say that's the answer.
All right, thank you.
It's
Time is
mathematically
expired.
identical. It's the algebra.
Mr. Reichert is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor, I do agree with you. This is a timely hearing, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this. This debt ceiling discussion is certainly centered around, as we watched it, taxes and spending. And I think everyone recognizes there needs to be tax reform. We'd like a simpler tax code and a tax process, but I think more than anything, Americans across this country recognize that we have a spending problem. We're spending money we don't have. So as we look at tax reform as a part of our economic solution, financial solution, I was listening to Mr. Bartlett, who mentioned that used houses were not taxed and new homes are taxed. And so I want to ask the professor and Mr. Bartlett, what will be the impact to new construction of homes under this plan if used homes are not taxed, new construction is taxed? Home buyers would be obviously directed toward buying used homes. Is that not correct? What would be the impact to our new construction and the home buying industry?
Well, the price of new homes would go up in the marketplace relative to, old homes would go up in the marketplace, so it would lead to a capital gain on old homes. That's why under the purple tax plan that I've put forward, I tax housing uniformly, no matter whether it's new or old, by taxing the imputed rent, the consumption services from the housing, whether it's new housing or old housing, under the purple tax, which is a modification of the fair tax proposal. This problem that I see with the fair tax gets corrected, and we have a bigger tax base, and I also tax imputed rent on yachts and on private airplanes. I think that all of consumption should be taxed, and so that's what's part of the purple tax. And I also deal with one of Bruce's concerns in the purple tax. I might take a second just to mention, and he's concerned, and I think there's a concern about evasion because the tax rate under the fair tax is 30%. That's relatively high. So what I propose in the purple tax is to have a fair tax at a 17.5% nominal rate, a 15% effective rate, and then take the FICA tax and make that progressive. Get rid of the ceiling on the FICA tax and exempt the first $40,000 of the employee part of the FICA tax from taxation. Get rid of the first $40,000 taxes, the employee-based taxes for the first $40,000 of earnings. Now you have a progressive FICA tax, a lower rate fair tax with a demo grant, two progressive elements, and also a 15% inheritance tax. That's what the purple tax plan is. So I think we need to think broadly about consumption taxation. We can implement it in a lot of different ways. And we shouldn't just say, we shouldn't say, just because somebody is trying to talk about the merits and demerits of the fair tax, you're the fair tax guy, and therefore you're the enemy. Let's try and understand what we really care about. We care about progressivity, we care about incentives, we care about fair treatment between generations, and we want to make sure that we can get our fiscal policy in order. We don't want to default.
So, Professor, under a clean, let's say a clean fair tax,
yeah.
This would apply to this old versus new language. Would apply to homes. Would apply to boats. Would apply to yachts. Would it apply to commercial construction? And would your purple tax cover commercial construction?
No, commercial building construction for buildings that are used in production of goods and services, that's not taxed. It's just consumption of goods and services by households and purchases of consumption items by governments would be, and nonprofits. All of consumption, what the national income accounts record as consumption, that would be the tax base. So I'm saying take the fair tax. If you like the fair tax, well, think about maybe modifying it so that all of housing consumption services are subject to taxation, so that all of the services from private jets and yachts are subject to taxation. That makes it a more fair tax.
Used cars, new cars.
Used car, I get an excise tax I have to pay every year to my local town in Massachusetts. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Neal is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartlett, one of the arguments that our Republican friends frequently have made here over decades is that tax cuts pay for themselves. I noted in the blog that you recently wrote about Governor Pawlenty's position that indeed you suggest that tax cuts don't pay for themselves. And as a Treasury official who served with President Reagan, could you explain to the committee why you don't believe that tax cuts pay for themselves?
Well, first of all, nobody ever in the Reagan administration ever said that the Reagan tax cut would pay for itself. The documents that the administration sent to Capitol Hill in February of 1981 all showed standard revenue losses based on Joint Committee Treasury methodology that's been around forever. And in fact, if you check Congressional Budget Office documents from that time period, and keep in mind the CBO was then headed by, I believe Mrs. Rivlin was still head of it, showed revenue losses almost identical to those projected by the administration. Now, the argument that we were making when I was working for Jack Kemp was that you wouldn't lose as much as the static revenue loss, because if you got some growth in the economy, that would enlarge the tax base and you would get back some of that money. Now, eventually, Larry Lindsay, an economist who's probably known to this committee, wrote a book, and he concluded that you got back maybe a third. So you lose 2/3, and that's, I think, pretty standard public finance theory. The only tax cut that I've ever heard anybody credibly assert pays for itself is occasionally you can cut the capital gains tax, but that's because capital gains involves gains that may have taken place over a long period of time, and if you realize them all at once, then you can get an unlocking effect and possibly pay for itself. But in general, tax cuts lose revenue. I don't know who really argues that point.
Thank you. And Governor Huckabee, the Treasury Department and the Joint Committee on Taxation, they've concluded that a rate significantly higher than 23% would be necessary for a fair tax to be fiscally neutral. And I cite the examples of joint tax and Treasury because they tend to be made up of Democrats and Republicans who, in the next life, want to be noted and known for their honesty as they secure a position in the private sector. They've suggested that, and by the way, they're not paid for their advocacy, as you know, other than by the taxpayer, that rate actually would have to be closer to 50% to make up for lost revenue. I mean, I've listened to Dick Armey and others over many years talk about transition costs, and they're substantial. Go ahead.
I've never heard the 50% figure, and I think that would be, frankly, one of the issues that one of the economists could better address. But I do know that, politically speaking, the simplification of the tax code would be much preferable to a tax code that is beyond anyone's comprehension. And what I believe that is without the ability to refute is that the complications of our current tax code make it so that business owners no longer are making business decisions, they're making tax decisions.
But even Dick Armey, as the majority leader, stated as he offered his sales tax proposal at the time, which we acknowledge is a bit different than what we're discussing here. Dick Armey used to say that not only would there be a substantial transition cost that was frankly enormous, but he also stated that we had to be in the vicinity of 28 to 30% to secure the same level of
Congressman, I
revenue.
wonder if I could
Yeah, that's
make
fine.
this
Just, I
simple.
want to leave just a moment for me to question Professor Kaltikoff after that. Go ahead, Mr. Turk. Please, go ahead.
Oh, I would make this simple. Our research is online. It's simply a matter of going through the national income and product accounts and going through the statute and figuring out what the base is and then figuring out what the rate is. If we could all sit down over a spreadsheet and resolve this question in a few minutes. Let me be more realistic and say a few days. But we came up with a rate of 23.82% for a hypothetical 2007 tax year. We redid the calculation in 2010. We think a lower rate would work. But it's not rocket science. It's simply getting the base correct, which we think we've done. I'd like to see the other calculations that lead to a different rate.
And Professor Kaltikoff, appreciate your testimony. You mentioned the phrase transitional cost.
Yeah.
And that's a fair statement, but there is a transitional cost, and that's been part of the discussion that we've had for a long period of time. And you mentioned lawn care as an example.
Right.
Are you satisfied that in Wellesley and in Southie and Dorchester and Hungry Hill and Springfield and Worcester that these people that are cutting lawns during the summer, they're all currently complying with IRS regulations?
No, I'm sure they're not. And
but do you think if we move to another system?
I'm saying that we have to think out of the box. There's technologies available now, I think, that can help us to enforce even their paying taxes.
All right. Time has expired. Thank you. Dr. Bustani is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're having this hearing. I'm finding it helpful, given that I'm certainly getting a lot of calls from constituents back home in Louisiana about the fair tax, so I'm finding this very helpful to flesh out some of the issues. I want to explore the issue of small business compliance and potential burdens on small businesses if we go to this type of tax system. Right now, we're very concerned about jobs and job creation, especially with small businesses, as we look at our economy. And Mr. Bartlett, as I understand it, small businesses across the U.S. would be responsible for collecting this fair tax. In addition, small businesses would have to maintain certain segregated accounts for the payment of taxes, and larger sellers would actually have to provide a security deposit equal to or greater than $100,000 or 1.5 times the seller's average monthly tax liability during the previous 6 calendar months. Given all that, if we went to this type of system, talk to me a little bit about the compliance burden on small businesses, the impact this might have on jobs.
It's hard to say what the impact on jobs would be, but there's no question that there'll be a vast increase in the compliance burden on small businesses. Basically, to reduce the compliance burden on individuals, you have to increase it on businesses. They're the ones who are going to be responsible for being the IRS's tax collectors. They're going to have to collect the revenue and transmit it to the Treasury. And as we know, we already have enormous problems in that area, in the small business area, where they're having great difficulty complying with the taxes. It's very well known. I mean, they have to collect already Social Security and payroll taxes and transmit them, and oftentimes small businesses need that cash flow, and they use it as to cover other expenses, and they end up being in trouble with the IRS. So there's no question that there'll be an increased burden on small businesses, no question.
Thank you. Professor Kotlikoff.
Well, you're getting rid of under the fair tax proposal, getting rid of the FICA tax, so they won't have to comply with that. I presume they would be able to get software that would help them have their, deal with this segregation of the accounts. I don't see this as a huge thing. I go into a lot of small stores. They're in operation. Even they're paying the Massachusetts sales tax when I buy something. This is just going to be an extra tax, sales tax that's collected, and it's all going to be the software's job to get this right. It's not going to be the actual owners that he's going to have to actually do calculations and write out it. It'll all be automated, I believe. And the federal government can certainly assist small businesses with that technology if need be.
Thank you. Governor Huckabee, you've traveled around the country a great bit and spoken to many, many people across this great country of ours. Have you heard those concerns in the context of a fair tax among small business owners?
Congressman, small business owners love the fair tax because of the simplicity of it. Right now, they're eaten up with complying with an incredibly impossible to understand tax code that requires them to hire lawyers and accountants at a good deal of their profit. The fair tax means that anyone can figure up 23%. It doesn't take a lawyer and an accountant to come up with figuring that up. So this idea that it's complicated, I would contest that. I think it's quite the opposite. It's the simplicity of it that causes small business owners with whom I have spoken all over the country to embrace this, because they'd rather put their money in putting products on the shelves and employees on their floors, as opposed to sending checks to accountants and lawyers in order to help be a part of this $500 billion compliance cost that we currently have with the 67,000-page complex tax code.
Thank you. Professor Kotlikoff, the goal of the fair tax is to remove taxes, the taxes embedded within prices, and replace them with a clear, simple tax, 23%. Give me a little breakdown again on this price-wage issue that it came up earlier.
Yeah, the notion that the current system, that the prices in the current system, tax system, embed the current tax system is not correct. That's a number of adherents to the fair tax, supporters of fair tax, have come up with that proposition. It's not based in economics. It's just not right. Okay? The basic story is this. There's a price level, a price for let's say, a chicken, and that price is, the price level that, the retail price level set by the Federal Reserve by how much money it has and puts into the economy. And what's going to happen is that when we if we went to a fair tax, workers would receive more pay in their check because they wouldn't have to pay the FICA tax or the income tax. And then they'd also get the rebate check. And then they're going to go to the store, and if the Fed accommodates, the prices will be 30% higher, as Bruce indicated. That's correct. And then the question is, are they worse off or better off? And the answer is, if you look at Table 2, and other calculations can be done too, you find out that working people, poor people, are better off. They pay less taxes over their lifetime, measures a present value lifetime tax rate under this fair tax system, all in all, than they do under the current system. And they also have lower marginal effective tax rates. The marginal effective tax rate on saving becomes 0 under the fair tax. Our national saving rate, let me say again, is 0 last year. It's 0. It was 15% in 1965. We've driven it down to 0, okay? That's why we're importing so much capital from abroad, from China and other places. That's why we're running the current account deficits we are, because our national saving rate is so low. So we got better incentives, I think more progressivity, and more prospects for growth from this system, because as David was indicating, having no corporate income tax, and as the governor was indicating, is going to be a great boon. Look at what happened to Ireland when they cut their...
Thank you.
Yep.
Time has expired. Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. And it's a great conversation to have, and we'll need to have a conversation like this if we ever hope to be able to reform the tax code, although I'm not sure how fair this so-called fair tax proposal is. It's verging more on the fairy tale side of fair than it is on real fairness. My understanding is that there is no country, no state that has ever implemented anything along the lines of this so-called fair tax proposal, probably because it's unworkable for the reasons that have been discussed. And I think Mr. Neal pointed it out. How do you get compliance up to a point where that you really have everyone paying truly a fair share? And Mr. Bartlett, I don't know I know you've done a number of studies on this. I know you've worked in the administration, in government, and outside of it in the past. Are you familiar with any country or any place in the world ever where a proposal like this so-called fair tax proposal has been put in place?
No country, to my knowledge, has anything remotely like this. They have studied the idea of something like a fair tax, and in every case, they concluded that a value-added tax makes more sense if that's the route you want to go.
And that's because it's a lot easier to try to get compliance out of the folks who should be paying.
Yeah, I don't want to jump on what they'll be talking about on the next panel, but it's easier to administer and much harder to evade because it's embedded in the prices. But let me make another point, which is that...
And very quickly, because I want to go on...
Well, there are no two states that have exactly the same sales tax base, and no state has a sales tax base that's anywhere near as comprehensive as the fair tax.
And so you'll take a state like mine, California, which has a fairly high sales tax rate, but it's still under 10%. To buy a house in California, you're looking at $200,000 to $500,000, depending on what part of the state you live in, to have to pay a 30% tax on top of the price of that home, or whether it's just to buy a computer or to buy a car all of a sudden you're calculating 30% more on a tax. If you go to a state like Virginia that has a far lower sales tax than my state of California, I think it's somewhere around 6%, 5 or 6%, you go to 30%, all of a sudden somebody making 50 grand is looking at how you purchase that house or that new dishwasher or clothes washer. It makes it a little bit more difficult. But as interesting a conversation as this is, it's still academic, and we're a week away from something that's not academic, and that is this whole discussion of whether or not the country will pay its debts. And so I'm hoping I can maybe get you all to concentrate a bit more on the revenue aspect of this crisis that's been manufactured, because the reality is we've always found a way to get past this issue of paying our bills. Yet this time it seems like we've hit an intractable resolution to this. And so, Mr. Bartlett, you wrote an interesting article recently that where you talked about what happens when you deal with the tax code, tinker with the tax code, and make it sound like it's going to do one thing and have it do something totally different. Back in the early 2000s, we were running budget surpluses, and President Bush at that point told us we could actually reduce the size of those surpluses by returning money to the American people, the taxes that they had paid, because we had these massive surpluses, $5.6 trillion in surpluses over the coming 10 years. And so these tax cuts were passed. You wrote this article that points out that not only have we, as a result, drained the Treasury of trillions of dollars of revenue, which now makes these deficits loom far larger, but that at the same time, we didn't see the commensurate growth in the economy that would help produce the jobs, that would help produce more revenue by people paying more taxes. Can you comment a bit on that, what you found?
Yes, I actually have an article in the New York Times this morning on exactly that point. I note that according to the CBO, the Bush tax cuts reduced federal revenues by about $3 trillion below what they would have otherwise been, and you got about another $3 trillion loss of revenues due to slower than expected economic growth, and then you got about $6 trillion of additional spending for unpaid wars and various things of that sort. So you went from a $6 trillion surplus to a $6 trillion deficit, which is a turnaround of $12 trillion. Now, I think the argument is very commonly made that we cannot raise taxes because it will destroy the economy. That same identical argument was made in 1982 when Ronald Reagan put forward the largest peacetime tax increase in American history. We had massive growth thereafter. The same argument was made in 1993 when President Clinton raised taxes. We had a very strong economy. The argument for the Bush tax cuts, at least one of them, was that we would have faster growth. We had the worst 10 years of economic years since the Great Depression. And so it seems, at least superficially, the relationship is the opposite. Higher taxes actually raised economic growth, and tax cuts caused the economy to collapse. I'm just saying you could make that argument based on the history.
All right, thank you. Dr. Price is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the panelists as well. This has been an exciting conversation to have. I want to commend the chairman for holding this hearing, because I think it's important to talk about solutions, and I believe this is one of those types of programs that could truly be a solution for our country. The current tax system, as so many have said, is incredibly broken. It's remarkably complex. The costs of compliance are massive, and it has the government picking winners and losers, which all of us ostensibly say that we don't want, which makes the fair tax, I think the national retail sales tax, remarkably attractive. It is simpler, the cost of compliance is less, and it certainly is much more fair. As the governor pointed out in his comments, we say we want success, we say we want hard work, we say we want vision, we say we want entrepreneurship, we say we want savings, we say we want job creation, and yet in our tax system we punish every single one of them, which is, I think, again, what makes the fair tax something that we all ought to take a very serious look at, because it rewards savings, it rewards hard work, it rewards entrepreneurship, it rewards job creation. In addition, it does a couple of things I think that are important to point out. One is that it captures all of the underground economy that we currently aren't capturing right now, and that's estimated to be a third of our economy by some folks. It would decrease the cost of doing business by 23%, virtually overnight. I beg to differ with Mr. Bartlett, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And it's a less regressive system, so it's more fair to individuals at the bottom end of the economic spectrum. So I'm excited by having this conversation. I'm concerned that some seem to be imprisoned by their past deeds and comments, but I am enthused and excited by folks actually gaining a greater understanding of what I believe to be, as Mr. Truitt said, a solution to the challenges that we've got right now. Mr. Bartlett mentioned that if the proponents of this say that it decreases the costs of the services or the goods by 23%, adds in a 23%, so the consumer sees basically a wash, which I think is accurate. And Mr. Bartlett says, well, why on earth would you need the prebate if that were so? Well, the fact of the matter is we believe that the prebate is appropriate because the current system is unfair. The current system is remarkably regressive and punishes those individuals at the lower end of the economic spectrum. So that's the reason that the prebate is needed, and then those individuals would actually have a much more fair system. Mr. Turk, I want to touch on Table 2 because I think it's incredibly important to
which table? I'm sorry.
Table 2. This is the one that talks about lifetime tax rates. And if you look at, this is for young adults, middle-aged seniors, married individuals, single households, and for every single line that you have here, whether it's 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 250,000, et cetera, for every single line compared to their the current system and their lifetime tax rates compared to the fair tax, every single one of them has individuals paying less under the fair tax system. Every single one. How can that be?
Well, first of all, that's Larry's table, so I'm going to ask him to comment on it. We did our own calculation, and we broke individuals down by spending deciles, which is a way of, in a way, mirroring Larry's own approach. And what we find is that the people in the lowest spending deciles would all gain, and more so over time as the economy expanded, and the people who would lose were the ones in the top spending deciles. That reflects current economic thinking about the way to address the progressivity-regressivity issue. And I would only add to that that I wonder what this committee would say if somebody walked in this room and said, I have a plan for broadening the base, cutting the rate, and by every economic standard imaginable, growing the economy. What do you think about that? That's what the fair tax does. It has a broader base, and therefore it has a lower rate. And if you read any economics textbook, I don't know whether you believe them or not, but if you read them, moving toward a consumption tax untaxes net investment and expands the economy.
Couldn't agree more. But Mr. Kotlikov, everybody here wins. How is that possible?
Well, because Warren Buffett loses, because the rich, there's a tax on wealth associated with, this is really a tax on what happens to workers, what happens to their lifetime tax payments as a share of their lifetime labor income. And it's assumes some wealth holdings, but the super wealthy in this country, a lot of them don't pay any taxes, and they would pay taxes under the fair tax because whenever they buy their yachts or their jets or their cars or their homes or their villas, they would pay taxes under what I'm proposing on the imputed rent from those services from those durables. And when they bought expensive restaurant meals, they would pay tax. So this is a Democrat's fantasy, this proposal.
All right.
And I
Thank
just
you.
can't.
Time has expired.
More fair.
We'll end
Thank
on
you.
that note. Mr. Thompson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple questions on the particulars, maybe of the fair tax. Maybe one of the professors could answer. Is the internet purchases would be taxed?
Yes.
So we would be taxing the
All
internet?
consumption, if it's consumption, yeah.
Would churches be taxed?
I believe, yeah, they're all consumption
Okay,
by
churches would be
nonprofits,
taxed?
yeah.
Church payments to their employees would not, as I recall, but it's, I could get that answer to you.
I may be wrong on that.
So churches would or wouldn't be taxed?
Would not, well, to that extent.
Pardon me?
To that extent, as I recall, I have to check, but as I recall, the payments to their employees would not be taxed.
So the churches, their taxes to their employees wouldn't be, but any of their purchases would be?
That's correct. That's what I recall.
Corporations, how are they handled? They're taxed?
There's no corporate income tax. Corporations are not buying consumption.
No corporate tax.
Right.
What if I work for a corporation and the corporation buys me my car? Is that purchase taxed?
I think the way the fair tax would handle that is it would assess taxes, and the corporation would have to affirmatively show that this was used for business purposes. So I think they would take the money at the dealership. The tax would be charged.
From who? Who would they take the money from?
Well, from the corporation that buys the car.
Okay.
Or they would send the corporation an excise tax for the car, and then the corporation would have to show that this was actually used for business purposes.
So if I, not working for a corporation, went down and bought a car, I would be taxed?
Yeah, now again, I'm proposing that the taxes on durables on homes and cars be done as an annual, like an excise tax, imputed rent, the tax on what we call the imputed services from these durables, like the car, you would be paid each year. You pay a tax on it.
I'm just having a hard time understanding how this is at all progressive if I, as a regular person, buy a car and I'm taxed, but the corporations avoid that. If I work for a corporation, let me finish my question so you know how to answer.
Yes, sir.
So if I work for a corporation, somebody else, I guess nobody pays the tax, and people who get either meals or computers or cars from their employer, which would probably be wealthier people, getting back to what Mr. Lewis was talking about, that division between the rich and the poor, they'd be handled.
I see your concern, and I think the way to handle that would be to basically tax the purchases. You know, if a corporation buys food to pay for its to give lunch to its employees, that should be subject to taxation.
That sounds pretty confusing. And
if it buys lunch for its employees, it should be subject to taxation.
it just doesn't look very progressive nor very fair to me. Everybody gets the same prebate, and everybody pays the same tax rate, unless, of course, somebody else is buying your stuff for you. Then you get a break. Mr. Bartlett, you had talked about the problems associated with default or the threat of default and what this would do to our economic system. Would higher interest rates be part of this?
Well, people on Wall Street, there's a report out from J.P. Morgan that's been widely cited, has said that interest rates would probably rise by about 60 basis points. That's 0.6 percentage points in the event of a default. But I really think that focusing on interest rates may understate what really may happen. Like I said, my great fear is that a complete nuclear-type meltdown.
I don't want to understate it. I just want to point out that if it's a little bit or a lot, that means car loans, the price of a car loan goes up, the price of a home loan goes up, the price of a small business loan goes up. This all impacts regular people working, trying to make a living. It would be an incredible increase on them personally, on their finances. In the article that you referenced, I was trying to read through it. You talked about what's commonly called the Bush tax cuts, and you mentioned to my colleague, Mr. Becerra, that they didn't pay for themselves. Did they bring us a higher rate of economic growth?
No, they did not.
So they didn't pay for themselves, and we didn't see any economic growth as a result of those Bush tax cuts.
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Ms. Jenkins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you all for being here. I find this very helpful, and I'm sure the American people do too. As our committee continues to hold hearings on fundamental tax reform, one motivation we have behind our efforts is to stimulate economic growth through lower taxes and to lessen the burden on the taxpayers and to reduce their complexity. Fair tax advocates have claimed that after implementation of the fair tax, the economy would grow at 10.5%, exports would grow by 26%, and investment by 41%. Employment would be 9% higher, and that real pre-tax wages would increase by 11.5%. So I would just like each of the panel members to maybe comment for us about the claims and why they believe that we might see increased exports, increased employment, and growth in GDP investment in the economy. If the governor would like to go first.
There's been a lot of talk about that this system would be complex. The reality is it's not complex, not compared to what we have now. Are there some complications? Of course there are. But I always want to say that if we compare the complications to the complications of the current tax code, I cannot imagine how anyone would defend the current tax code against the proposals of the fair tax, which is, in its worst description, much simpler. And the reason that some of these numbers that the economists have come up with, and again, as I said at the beginning, I don't pretend to be the chemist, just the pharmacist. I can't tell you how they arrived at some of the numbers, but I trust that their numbers are carefully researched. But it makes perfect sense to me that if you simplify anything, it's going to be less expensive. And the reason that so much of what you see in the fair tax is effective is because it does simplify things for the individual who now stays up until midnight rushing down to the post office on April 15th trying to get the tax form in the mail, or generally goes to a tax preparer and hopes they get it right. And often CPAs are trying to figure out every year all the changes in the tax code that may come from this city. Wouldn't it be much simpler if, in fact, that there was pretty straightforward approach, that here's the percentage of tax on the things that you purchase. And it's the transparency of it that makes it more effective. And when I hear people say, but things will cost more, we can't even say that unless you equally say people show up at the marketplace with their entire paycheck, something they've never done before. So it's not going to change dramatically except for the people at the lowest end of the economic spectrum, as has been pointed out. They're going to come out better off.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Congresswoman. The calculations for the growth of the economy are based on simulating a large-scale life cycle model that takes into account people's incentives, but also what we economists call income effects. When you put on, we have to realize that this decline in the national saving rate that's occurred over, 5 decades, 6 decades now, has corresponded to a major increase in the absolute and relative consumption of the elderly. There's been a huge transfer from young savers to old spenders systematically through time, through the entitlement programs that we've been running. So if you really want to understand why consumption's gone up, why national savings gone down, why investment's gone down, it has to do with this redistribution from young savers to old spenders. Why are people who are older spenders? Well, they're closer to the end of their lives. Now, when you have the fair tax, when you go to a consumption tax, because the older people hold disproportionate amounts of the wealth, they're going to be hit with a relatively higher tax burden. So their consumption is going to be reduced relative to that of younger people. So part of the advantage of a fair tax is it undoes some of the redistribution away from the young towards the old that we've been engaged in this economy. And it gets the older people to consume less, and consequently the total economy consumes less, saves more, and there's more investment, more funds to be invested. In addition, there's better incentives to save because you move away from an income tax which discourages saving to one that's neutral with respect to consuming today versus tomorrow. The third thing is that you eliminate the corporate income tax so that companies, international companies, are thinking about whether to invest here or there, say, well, gee, if we invest in the U.S., there's no corporate income tax anymore. So these three elements are the main reason why you see in these simulations some very significant effects through time. It's not supply-side magic. It's not that at all. There's no supply-side gobbledygook here. I'm not a supply-side nut, okay? I think a lot of those folks have done a lot of disservice to economics. This is just good old plain-fashioned neoclassical economics delivers the goods if you actually look at what's going on in terms of who gets what under this system.
All right, thank you.
I yield back.
And I also want to thank Governor Huckabee for being here before I recognize Mr. Pascrell. I understand you have a plane to catch, and I would just say that some members may wish to submit questions in writing to you that have not had an opportunity to question you. If you could be kind enough to respond in writing, then they will be part of the formal hearing record.
Mr. Chairman, I would be delighted to, and I want to thank all of the members for the opportunity to be here, and I wish I could stay, but unfortunately, the airlines will not hold a plane for me.
I understand.
Maybe for you, but not for me.
No, that's not the case at all.
I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very, very much, Governor.
We're in the same boat.
All right, Mr. Pascrell is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I've heard a lot of much mention today of the current tax system. I certainly hope that the two of you remaining, and of course Mr. Bartlett, I hope you're not speaking for the poor, because we've had a lot of people come in front of us that want to make life a lot better for the poor, and we have seen it over decades. And I don't have to bring your attention to the figures that came out this morning, and the gap has grown greater. And this foolish proposal that is before us makes the matter hideous in my eyes. The poor and the middle class do not make the tax code Moby Dick. The 2,000 of the 2,300 pages are there because folks want to keep what they have, and they have every right under the law to do that. The tax code. So a lot of folks have to hire lawyers to keep what they have. And it's a shame that they have to hire all those lawyers. So you're saying that if we put this into effect in this nation, that we will not go through that particular rigmarole. Look, let's look at the myths that came out today. Quite obvious. The tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 did not increase employment in the United States of America, did not increase productivity in the United States of America. The trickle down that was promised then, is promised now, has never worked. Why in God's name do we continue on that path, which doesn't make any sense? And furthermore, it wasn't until 2005 that we even increased the revenue, right, Mr. Bartlett? Is that correct?
I believe that was the first. I believe that was the first year that nominal revenues were higher than they had been in 2000.
And then we saw what happened after that.
Well, we had a crash.
Oh, let's be clear. Let's be clear. A national sales tax would be nothing more, in my perception, than an enormous windfall for the very wealthy of this country. Because plain and simple, the wealthy do not spend, you've heard it over and over again, some of you have said it yourselves, as much as their income of the lower income families or the middle class. They just don't, as a percentage of their income. Mr. Bartlett, how much more would the national sales tax have to be in order to be revenue neutral? How much more would it have to increase?
Well, actually, you have a panelist on the next panel who can answer that better than me. Roseanne Altshuler was the chief economist for the Bush administration's tax reform panel, and they did calculations on exactly this subject that showed that you'd have to have...
And what did they conclude?
Well, it depends on how much evasion you think you'd get. If it was about the same as the median state, 39%, or 47% if you have a higher...
Okay, my next question is this. What would be the effect on the debt? Someone asked you about this very briefly before. If we were to create the largest entitlement program, and it would become the largest entitlement program, it would supersede Social Security and Medicare. If we had this prebate program that they're talking about in the fair tax, what would happen to the debt of this nation?
Well, the prebate is in the base of their. I mean, they've calculated that cost. Okay, so it's not over and above it.
And what does it do to the debt?
Well,
the whole calculation.
It would increase government spending, is what it would do.
What would increase the debt exactly?
Well, the estimates of the cost of the rebate that the Bush tax reform panel made were there would be upwards of $800 billion a year.
What did President Bush say about this plan, by the way, this
Well,
proposal back in the mid-2000s? What did he say?
Well,
the last decade, what did he say about this plan?
About the fair tax?
Yeah.
I don't know that he ever said anything about it, but I could be mistaken. He certainly didn't endorse it. He didn't even endorse his own tax reform
That's
proposal.
true. As a former Reagan Treasury official, how many times did Mr. Reagan raise the debt ceiling?
It was either 17 or 18 times, I believe.
And can you briefly explain how the value of a Treasury note affects the life of everyday Americans?
Well, as I said before, it's the foundation upon which much of the financial system rests. If you go to the market to sell corporate bonds, for example, they're historically priced off of the equivalent Treasury. So it's absolutely essential to have some asset for which there is no default risk in order to establish prices for a great many other financial products.
All right, thank you. Mr. Paulson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the panelists taking the time to talk about consumption taxes. We've had a multitude of hearings, actually, in the Tax Committee laying the foundation for tax reform. This is the first chance we've really had to engage in some of the consumption tax ideas, and the fair tax being one. I like some of the concepts that are brought forward about the transparency, about driving investment, because we all, I think, are in favor of promoting the job creation aspect, which is so desperately needed when we have 18,000 jobs coming out a month. It's so anemic. Let me ask you this question, because I do have some concerns. Right? Tell me how this would work, because the impact of tax reform for those that are already retired is something we're paying attention to, and how do you drive or encourage retirement savings in the long run? And so if the fair tax gets implemented, how do you transition, or how do you move forward for the folks that have already essentially worked all their lives, they've paid under the income tax, and we move into a new system now where now they're going to pay under consumption and they only have their retirement savings? How do you transition or kind of make that work for them? And just help me, and maybe talk a little about Mr. Kotlikoff first, Mr. Turk.
Okay, well, it's a good challenge. You have people with 401k accounts who haven't paid taxes yet on those balances. I think you'd have to tax those during the transition so that they would be, that we would get the right amount of revenue from them, or fair amount of revenue from them, and not just give them carte blanche or scot-free. So you'd have to have that occur. And capital gains that had not been realized, I think that would have to be realized and subject to taxation. And then, but at the margin, you're immediately taxing consumption. And again, I think it should be all of consumption, including imputed rent on housing and other durables. And now, some people are going to be, is this going to absolutely help everybody? It's not going to be a free lunch. No, and I'm saying that the people that are really going to get hurt differentially are the rich. So if I came here and told Mr. Pasquale that I was advocating a tax on wealth and using the tax revenues to lower the tax on wages, you would think I'm a pretty far left person, economist. Well, you might. Some other people might. Okay. Well, I'm just saying, please, let's talk, maybe after the hearing, let's talk and converse, and let me try and persuade you what economics has to say, because there's lots of being said about the fair tax that is not about economics. Lots of statements that aren't being made by economists about it. But it is a really progressive tax structure. I think it's more progressive than the current system.
Mr. Turk, do you have any follow-up on that, just in terms of those that are in retirement savings or promoting retirement savings as a part of the tax code?
Well, I'm currently drawing down some of my pension, on which I didn't pay taxes when it was being accumulated, and now the IRS is taking a chunk of that as I draw it down. So in my case, it would be a wash. Either I'm going to let the IRS grab a chunk of it, or I might end up paying more for consumption goods because the price has gone up. It seems to me that it's neutral in that respect. Larry makes a persuasive argument, and he does it better than anybody else, that this is a tax on the wealthy. So I think there would be people who have saved over their lifetime who would find that this was a burden, and that has to be a part of his argument, as I understand it.
And let me ask this too, because I know you characterize it as certainly being a tax on the wealthy, and Governor Huckabee, I know, had to leave, but I think there's an exemption for educational services as a part of the proposal. How do you avoid, as exists with the tax code right now, having a situation where folks come forward and say, look, we'd like to exempt this or this group? I mean, how do you avoid that in the long term as you put this system
first
together?
of all, I propose under this purple tax reform, no exemptions of any kind. So I'm an educator, and I'm urging that we tax educational expenditures, because I think a good chunk of what people pay for in college is consumption, not education, from what I can tell. And but the rebate is there to deal with concerns about progressivity, so that if somebody says, look, let's exempt bread and eggs, well, the rebate is there to make sure that poor people, anybody living at the poverty line, or anybody's in terms of income at the poverty line or lower, is going to have enough money from the rebate to cover all their fair tax payments at the store. So that would be the way that you can try and avoid having the tax undone. And the whole idea of the fair tax is to have one tax rate that everybody can look at and say, everybody's paying this tax rate, so that if we spend more money on anything or anybody, that tax rate has to go up. Under the current system, nobody knows when we spend more money down here in Congress who's paying the bill. The whole connection between the whole, value of having a single tax rate has to do with trying to connect our spending to our revenue source in a very concrete manner.
All right,
It's a
thank
great
you.
advantage.
Mr. Larson's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Camp, and thank the panelists for being here this morning. Let me start, first of all, with Mr. Bartlett, and I know others have gone down this line of questioning, but defaulting on the federal debt, I believe you said, would be analogous to what transpired when Lehman's went down, except on perhaps Lehman's on steroids. In the Reagan administration, you took a balanced approach, both in terms of dealing with debt ceilings, but also making cuts, but also balancing them off with revenues. Is that pretty much how this current situation should be approached?
Well, I personally would favor a balanced approach. I think one of the biggest problems we have right now is that revenues are too low. They are less than 15% of GDP and have been for the last 3 years. So if there's any truth to the idea that low taxes spur growth, we should be growing like crazy. Obviously, we're not. We have other problems. One point I would like to make that hasn't really quite come out here is when Professor Kotlikoff talks about the importance of national savings, he's of course correct, but the deficit is negative saving. Therefore, if we raise revenues in such a way as to reduce the deficit, that will add to national savings. And that was what happened, frankly, during the Clinton administration. That's why we had budget surpluses, and the added saving is what created a lot of the economic growth that I wish we still had.
Another question that comes up often, and I'm glad that we have two economists here, et cetera, and let me say that I think the current system that we operated under is flawed. Mr. Neal has been trying to simplify this system for some time now in a number of his proposals. But there's a debate that rages on here with respects to the very fragile recovery that we're in terms of both cuts and taxes. Now, people will say, and I don't disagree with them, that raising taxes at this time in a frail economy is not a wise thing because of the fragility. Is cuts a wise thing, or do cuts result in hurting a fragile economy? Do cuts that result in layoffs and people on unemployment and furthering what has to come out of the federal proceeds? How would you categorize those? Is the difference between the two?
You mean cuts in spending? Or cuts in taxes?
Cuts in general. Taxes, being raised, or cuts to programs that lay off people.
I'm sure that all spending cuts hurt people, and in many cases, people that we don't want to hurt. But the problem is that we're having the wrong conversation. I personally don't have a clue as to whether canceling some of the Bush tax cuts would affect the economy one way or another. What I do know is that we have a hopelessly convoluted tax system where we can't get the base straight, when what we ought to do is we ought to change the base into a consumption base so that then we know that we're untaxing investment.
Let's say that
and
could
growing
be
the
true.
economy.
Would you be willing to look at a hybrid, or how long of a transition period do you think that would take?
I think that the transition would require a lot of adjustments.
How long would you say that might take?
I think we could transition to a fair tax within a year or two.
Within a year?
Yes.
And during that time, what would you do with the existing tax system?
Well, the existing tax system would go away, and we would then impose the tax on consumption to replace those revenues. And indeed, if we impose it at the current statutory 23%
I'm trying to
rate.
figure this out. Just so within a year's time, we would move out of the internal revenue system and go to a collection of consumption taxes. And how would that end up in a neutral situation, given? Don't you think you ought to give yourself a little more time than that if you're?
I give it as much time as needed. It might be a little more than.
Well, then let me ask you this, because that's where I was leading. I would think that you would need more time. Would you be willing to put in your consumption tax and have that consumption tax be dedicated only to reducing the deficit as you try to figure out just in fact what its implications will be, and have an economic model that's out there?
Well, as I've indicated, I have this proposal called the purple tax, which retains the FICA tax, makes it progressive, very progressive, has a fair tax at basically half the level of at a 15% effective rate, and has an inheritance tax at 15%. The 15% solution is a very simple tax structure. I think it's more progressive than the current system. I think it'll generate at least 2% more of GDP than the current system. We need more revenue. So why don't you folks pass that today?
As you're working the modeling out with that specific tax, would you let that money all go while you're running almost tandem systems to reduce the national debt?
All right. Time has expired. Mr. Marchant is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the fact that the chairman's having these hearings with the goal of a simpler tax code, a lower tax rate, and as a result of that, having increased revenues to the government. I think that is something that this panel should discuss at length, and I appreciate the fact that we're doing that. I'd like to talk about an average family in my district and how this fair tax proposal would affect that family. Let's say it's a man and wife. They're both working. One's a school teacher, one's a fireman. They have 2 kids. They have a gross income of about $8,000 a month. Will they have any FICA tax withheld?
No FICA tax.
Will their employer have FICA tax, any match?
No FICA tax.
So their income would go up about 7.5%. Their take-home would be about 7.5% higher.
Well, really it would be 15.3 because the employer portion is also going to be available to be handed out to the employee.
Is that in the proposal?
Well, economists think that that employers aren't paying our taxes for us out of the goodness of their hearts. We think that workers pay both the employee share and the employer share, and that when you eliminate the FICA tax, all 15.3% is going to end up in the hands of the employee. Sorry.
Okay, and so then whatever tax rate they had, let's say 20%.
Right.
Will they lose their mortgage deductions?
Well, there won't be any mortgage deductions because there won't be any income tax against which you can deduct
mortgage. Okay, so there'll be no income taxes.
Right.
So perhaps they'll get 25%. Maybe they'll get $20,000 of income tax that they won't pay.
Yeah, and this table two in this testimony dealt with all the issues of mortgage deductibility and the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit.
Well, a lot of the
all these-
people that are going to be watching this hearing in my district are not going to have the ability to have those tables. So,
Okay.
I mean, would their take-home pay be as high as $20,000 more a year?
Well, I don't want to, it's a hypothetical. I don't want to be imprecise and give you the wrong answer to that specific question. But if we looked in the table that I have here, which is, what was the income of the family?
Around $4,000 each a month.
So we're talking about 8,000. So we're talking about
About
like
$96,000.
100,000 a year. So let's look at a married couple who's 45 with a couple kids and a house, moderate-sized house, mortgage deduction. They're currently paying 24% of their remaining lifetime resources to the federal government in FICA and income taxes under the current system. Under the fair tax, it would be 14.7%.
I'm trying to talk about their month-to-month.
Yeah, their month-to-month take-home pay would go up.
So will this family qualify for a prebate?
Everybody gets a prebate, yes, they would.
So what number of checks would the federal government be cutting a month?
1 month to that family, based on their household size.
Okay, so how many is that? Would that be 100 million prebate checks a month?
Well, if we have it might be 130 million checks. Every American household would get a check.
So adding to in the
It could be sent electronically, by the way.
Right,
you're
I
checking it.
understand.
Right.
And then when they go to the grocery store, they're going to pay 23 to 23%.
Well, they pay the nominal rate's 30%. The effect, every dollar that you spend, 23 cents out of that dollar is going to go to taxes.
Okay,
So
how
that's what we
about
call it.
utilities?
Yeah, that's also consumption. Right.
Rent?
Rent, yes.
Gasoline?
Yes.
So everything that they consume then, they will pay the extra 23 to 30% on?
Yes.
And the theory being that this family, together with the amount of money that they keep, that they
Yes.
were paying, plus the prebate, are going to come out
Better off.
better off or whole?
Better off. And I didn't know the answer to the question until I did the calculations. This is my best judgment based on pretty careful, serious, and it wasn't a 2-day study either. It was very careful work.
Well, I have a tremendous number of people in my district that support the fair tax. I've read every book that I can available on the fair tax, and the prebate is my single largest mechanical problem that I haven't been able to work through. And but this will help me in answering the questions that I get on that.
I believe that.
All right, thank you. Time's expired. Ms. Black is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to the prebate, rebate, whatever the acronym is for that. But I'm not sure that I understand exactly how the information gets to the government to identify what their income is. If you don't have an income tax, how does the information get from the employer to the government to know what that salary is and how to figure that?
It doesn't have anything to do with the salary. It has to do with the composition of the family, whether it's a married couple, how many kids they have. And that's a mechanical formula. And once that's determined, then that determines the size of the prebate, the philosophy being that if that family were at the poverty level, they would pay no taxes under the fair tax.
So the prebate doesn't depend on your income. If you have a family of 4, you get one size demogrant. That's the word that Pat Moynihan used to use, I believe, when he advocated the negative income tax. He called it a demogrant, a monthly payment. So if you got a family of 4, you get one size. If you got a family of 3, it'd be a smaller check. But it wouldn't depend on your income.
So then how does that help those who are at the lower income?
Because it's going to be, for people that are low income, it's going to be a much bigger deal than for Bill Gates as a proportion. So progressivity is always taxes as a proportion of resources. And so that's why this would be progressive as conventionally defined in terms of what progressivity means.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. That clears that piece up.
Yeah.
This may or may not be a question that you as economists can answer, but I'm curious, in all of the information that I have here, I can't find anything that indicates what percentage of those are not paying any tax whatsoever at this point in time. We keep hearing there's about 47 to 50% of the people who pay nothing. Is that something that you can help with?
Close to 50% of individual taxpayers pay no personal income tax. That's correct. Close to that.
Yes, that's correct. But I want to make a point here that's relevant to your point, which is that if you have right now the poverty level income, you have a negative tax because of the earned income tax credit. You get a check from the government and pay zero, okay? And for most people in the bottom quintile, that rebate or the EITC is more than enough to compensate for both for your payroll taxes as well, so that you are literally paying zero. But you may still be getting more on top of that. But just keep in mind that if you're under the fair tax, if you're now at the poverty level income, the rebate compensates you for your consumption, but it doesn't. But you're going from negative to zero, which is a tax increase, you see. You're not getting the EITC anymore. And keep in mind also, there's a lot of confusion about the difference between consumption and income. If you look at the Consumer Expenditure Survey, you'll see that people in the bottom quintile spend about twice as much as their income. So the tax base that applies to consumption for people with low incomes is going to be higher, precisely because a lot of those people are the elderly who are drawing down saving. That's the point Professor Kotlikoff keeps getting at when he talks about taxing wealth. That's basically where the incidence of that wealth tax comes from.
So let me respond, if I could.
Yes, thank you.
We have, I think, some segment of very poor people who might, because of the EITC, might end up with a somewhat higher average tax rate, but the table incorporated the EITC, and there's not a whole lot of cells here where the average tax rate actually goes up under the fair tax. It basically goes down. There's a lot of very poor people that don't get the EITC because they don't have kids or they don't have, or they're not working. We have to also think about, in terms of the tax burden on older people, poor older people, the older people are going to get this rebate, just like everybody else, and their Social Security benefits are also going to be CPI indexed. So they're going to get an extra bonus here because when the price level goes up, their Social Security benefits are going to rise by 30%, and then they're also going to get the rebate. So this is actually going to redistribute toward the poorer elderly away from the rich and middle class elderly and get a bigger burden, tax burden on the rich and middle class elderly, and therefore lower the burden on younger people. We've had a massive redistribution away from younger people towards older people. That's why we're not, that's a large part of this deeper conversation we need to have about how to fix the fiscal system of the country.
All right, thank you. Mr. Reed is recognized. All right, Mr. Berg is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions. One question is on stability. I mean, what we want is a revenue source that's stable. That's how we need to plan. And I guess my question is, how would you compare the stability of, again, just going with the new consumption tax versus our current revenue?
Well, consumption taxes are going to be more stable than the current tax system because consumption is more stable over the economic cycle than income is. I don't have, maybe Larry's done some estimates of the difference it makes, but we found, for example, that if you had the 23% fair tax in effect in 2010, which is obviously a period of depressed economic circumstances, that we would have brought in more revenue than needed in order to pay the government's bills. And that's just largely because consumption was better than the rest of the economy.
Yeah. Well, I concur with that. The consumption is more stable than income. It's more stable than investment. It's so it's a more stable tax base and more reliable. And
yeah. Mr. Chairman, then my follow-up question really relates to the transactions that would be conducted by local and state government. I understand the individual, but as we go into local and state government and they're paying an additional 23% tax, how does that filter through the formula? It seems to me that they're not paying income now. They would pay this and so many of them are exempted now, but that would have an increased cost in local services or state services.
Well, in our calculations for revenue neutrality, we incorporate paying back compensating the government, state and federal, for the extra taxes that they're going to incur. So that the idea is to keep this revenue neutral, not to force governments to have a bigger burden through the back door.
It's a little tricky. The tax base at the state and local level would go down slightly, and that would represent a temporary boon to state and local taxpayers. But the states and local governments could compensate for that by adjusting their tax codes. They would have to do that, but an easy fix, for example, would be for the state to impose its own sales tax on top of the fair tax rate. That would adjust for that part of the problem. And then they might have to also make some adjustments in their income tax rates. At the end of the day, after everything was worked out, everybody would be whole. Everybody would be where they started out.
We spent, let me just say, we spent with several other economists at Suffolk University, we spent a good part of a year very carefully trying to figure out what tax rate would be revenue neutral. And we didn't know the answer before we sat down. And whatever the answer was going to come out, we were going to report it. And so when other people testify about the sales tax, let's make sure that the methodology was the same. I mean, we use the same methodology as Bill Gale, who's a major critic of the sales tax. He reviewed our study. He said it's the same methodology. There are some different assumptions here and there, but I think this is a very careful study. It's online, available to anybody to look at.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank our first panel for their testimony today. It's been very helpful, and I hope we're able to engage with you as we continue this discussion on fundamental tax reform. Members may wish to submit additional questions to you in writing for inclusion in the formal record, and I would just ask that you be prompt in responding to those questions if you do receive them. Again, let me thank you again for being here today, and I would now invite our second panel to come to the witness table.
Okay, great. You cleared the house out.
We're pleased to welcome our second panel, which features 6 individuals who are highly regarded as experts in value-added taxes. First, I would like to welcome and introduce Mr. Michael Gratz. Mr. Gratz is the Columbia Alumni Professor of Tax Law at Columbia Law School and is a Professor Emeritus of Law at the Yale Law School. In addition to his teaching career, Mr. Gratz served at the Treasury Department from 1990 to 1992. And second, we'll hear from Roseanne Altschuler. Ms. Altschuler is a professor in the Economics Department at Rutgers University. She has previously served as the director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, as a senior economist to the President's Advisory Panel of Federal Tax Reform in 2005, and as a special advisor to the Joint Committee on Taxation. And third, we welcome back Robert Carroll, a principal with Ernst & Young's Quantitative Economics and Statistics Group in the National Tax Department. Before joining Ernst & Young, Mr. Carroll served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis at the Treasury Department. And fourth, we will hear from Jim White, the Director of Tax Issues for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. As the Director of Tax Issues, Mr. White is responsible for work on IRS, tax administration, and tax policy. He has been with GAO since 1990. And fifth, we welcome Dan Mitchell, a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Prior to joining Cato, Mr. Mitchell was a Senior Fellow with the Heritage Foundation and previously served as an economist for the Senate Finance Committee. And finally, we welcome back Simon Johnson, the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., and from March 2007 to August 2008, Mr. Johnson was an economic counselor and director of the research department at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you all for your time today. The committee has received each of your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks. There will be a yellow light 1 minute out in which you can sum up before the red light comes on. Again, I look forward to hearing from all of you. Mr. Gratz, we'll begin with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Levin, and members of the committee for having me on this important subject. We know our tax system is broken. Nobody argues with that. The question is, what should we do about it? Until World War II, we had a consumption tax on most Americans and an income tax only on high-income individuals. And it was only the Second World War that extended the income tax to the masses. Since then, the U.S. is a low-tax country, but we're not a low-income tax country. So we've sacrificed our advantage in our low taxes by having income taxes that are comparable to those of other nations in the OECD. The biggest difference between the U.S. and everybody else is that we have no national level consumption tax, which 156 nations at last count do have. We know the problems with the income tax. The Congress uses the income tax the way my mother used to use chicken soup as a solution to every ill facing the country. And we know that we haven't solved the nation's health problems. We haven't solved the nation's education problems. We haven't solved the nation's energy problems, despite the many billions of dollars a year in tax deductions and credits that go in those directions. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 was a great success. It gave the income tax a good cleansing, but it has not proved stable. We can cleanse it again, as many people have proposed, and as most of the conversation around this committee has been over the last couple of years. But we know that it's going to get dirty rather quickly again. The other thing that has happened since the 1986 Act is that we're now in a world economy, and given the internationalization of the world economy, in my view, we really need to have a low income tax, particularly low corporate tax rates, in order to attract jobs to the United States, to attract investment to the United States, and to allow American workers and businesses to compete worldwide. I have advanced a tax reform plan in a book, 100 Million Unnecessary Returns, a simple, fair, and competitive tax system for the United States. I'm certainly happy to get a copy for any member or staff that'd like to read it. I know some of you have. Let me just review the pieces of my proposal. First, enact a value-added tax, which is basically a retail sales tax with withholding. The idea that you would not have withholding on an income tax strikes me as foolish. We're the only OECD country that does not have a value-added tax. Sometimes it's called a goods and services tax. Second, use the revenues from that tax to finance an income tax exemption of $100,000 and to lower substantially the rates above that amount. Third, lower the corporate income tax rate to 15%. And fourth, replace the earned income tax credit and provide low and middle income families with tax relief from the VAT burden through payroll tax offsets and through debit cards that allow them to avoid VAT on their purchases. This plan has many advantages over existing law. It would be more favorable to savings and investment and economic growth in America. It would take advantage of our status as a low-tax country. A 15% tax on corporate income would be among the lowest in the world. It would solve the problems of transfer pricing and other tax planning that goes on in the international community. Third, it would eliminate more than 100 million of the 140 million tax returns the IRS gets every year. 150 million Americans would never have to face the income tax. Fourth, there would be less temptation under such a small income tax for Congress to view tax exclusions, deductions, and credits as if they were solutions to America's problems. We know they're not. Fifth, a value-added tax would be border adjustable under WTO international trade rules, which means that it could tax imports and exempt exports, which an income tax cannot. Given the size of our trade imbalances, we would likely produce hundreds of billions of dollars in additional revenue from taxes on imports alone over the next 10 years. Sixth, it would avoid most of the difficult issues of transition that virtually all of the other tax reform proposals have. And finally, by using taxes that are common throughout the world, it would fit well with international standards. The Tax Policy Center, pursuant to a contract with the Pew Charitable Trust, has estimated the plan. They've got some preliminary numbers. They've given me permission to share them with the committee today. Basically, they say that for the year 2015, my plan is revenue neutral, with a value-added tax of under 12.5%, a 15% corporate income tax rate, a 16% tax on married couples between the $100,000 and $200,000 income, and a 25 or 26% rate on families above $200,000. This shows that you could dramatically reduce income tax rates. My proposal is also distributionally neutral, that is, unlike the fair tax, it does not shift, or the so-called fair tax, it does not shift the burden of taxes down the income scale. Given its widespread application around the world, it's clear that the U.S. can readily administer a value-added tax. I have been working over the last 2 years with a number of VAT managers and accounting firms and law firms around the world in an effort to design a model value-added tax for the United States, and I'd be happy to share some of that learning with the committee.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to keep the hearing moving, and your time has expired, so we'll move on to Ms. Altshuler. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Camp, Ranking Member Levin, and members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today. CBO analysis shows that the government began this year with a projected budget deficit of almost 10% of GDP, and its future growth is driven by rising health care costs, an aging population, and the interest payments on an ever-increasing public debt. Reducing the deficit to an economically sustainable level will require both a scaling back of expenditure programs and an increase in tax revenues. In work I've done with economists at the Tax Policy Center, we find that raising significantly more revenue from our current tax system, however, would be politically difficult and likely damaging to economic growth. The substantial near and long-term fiscal pressures facing the federal government require that we both reform our income tax system and consider new revenue sources, including federal taxes on consumption. A VAT is a type of consumption tax that's similar to a retail sales tax, but it's collected in smaller increments throughout the production process. The VAT is part of the tax systems of nearly 150 countries around the world, including all OECD member countries except the United States. Adding a VAT to the U.S. federal tax system could help address the medium and long-term revenue shortfalls forecast for the United States. The VAT is particularly effective in raising substantial amounts of revenue in a relatively efficient manner and has proven to be an administrable tax. If we were to adopt a VAT, we could rely on the experience and best practices of other countries in setting up and administering the tax. In addition to these attributes, the VAT has a number of other advantages. First, a portion of the revenues from a VAT could be used to finance reductions in statutory income tax rates, as Michael Gratz has just told us. Two tax systems, a VAT and an income tax with low tax rates, may be superior from an efficiency and administration perspective to an income tax system with higher statutory rates. Second, given the size of projected future budget deficits, adding a VAT to our current system to generate revenues for deficit reduction alone would likely have positive effects on economic growth. Third, a pre-announced and phased-in VAT might stimulate the economy by encouraging consumption in anticipation of the imposition of the tax. Finally, while the states are likely to protest, a properly designed VAT may actually help force them to redesign or improve their retail sales taxes. There's a number of issues that need to be addressed in designing and implementing a VAT, and I'll hit on a few of these issues in my remaining time. The distributional issues. The VAT is equivalent to a retail sales tax, but it's collected at different stages of the production process. Since higher income households save more than those with lower or moderate incomes, the burden of the tax increases with current income, reducing the overall progressivity of the tax system. The additional VAT burden, however, can be relieved for low and middle income households through refundable credits. This approach to relieving the VAT burden is more effective than exempting food and other necessities from taxation or applying preferential rates, since it can be targeted to lower and middle income households rather than all households. TPC has recently released a report that illustrates the impact of a 5% VAT on the distribution of income. While regressive in the absence of a rebate, the authors show that the impact on low and middle income households could be offset by allowing a rebate in the form of a refundable credit claimed on income tax returns. With the rebate, the VAT is progressive throughout almost the entire income distribution. The TPC study shows that one should not look at the distributional impact of the VAT in isolation. The progressiveness of the complete federal tax system, with VAT rebates, for example, must be taken into account. What about revenue? Well, policy analysts point out that given the fixed administrative costs of the VAT, if the U.S. adopts a VAT, it should be at a fairly substantial rate. Work again out of the Tax Policy Center suggests that with a 10% rate, a VAT with a broad base and a rebate to offset the regressivity of the tax could raise about 2% of GDP. It's important to think about how any tax instrument we use to raise additional revenue will affect economic growth. Recent work from economists at the OECD suggests that the VAT is more pro-growth than personal and corporate income taxes. Revenues from the VAT could be used to buy down the deficit and or reduce individual and corporate statutory tax rates. Large and persistent deficits can have negative effects on economic growth by reducing national savings, driving up interest rates, and increasing our reliance on foreign investors. A single-rate VAT on a broad base at a rate of 10% could go a long way towards reducing the economic burden of our large and growing debt. Using some VAT revenues to buy down statutory income tax rates would also have positive effects on growth. Lower marginal income tax rates on individuals and businesses would strengthen the incentives to save, invest, work, and innovate while making our tax system more efficient. The fiscal challenges ahead are daunting. The VAT on its own cannot solve the country's fiscal problems, and introducing a VAT has its own problems. If we adopted the VAT, we would have to institute some form of rebate to offset its regressivity and make every effort to adopt the broadest possible base. We would need to increase IRS resources for administration and be attentive to a range of compliance issues. But we must recognize that near and long-term fiscal pressures require that we raise more revenue from our tax system. The VAT is an efficient revenue raiser that's likely to be significantly less damaging to economic growth than increasing personal and corporate statutory rates. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Altshuler. Mr. Carroll, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Camp, Ranking Member Levin, distinguished members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding considerations for a value-added tax in the United States. The U.S. faces serious fiscal challenges over the next several decades as the federal deficit and debt are projected to rise to unsustainable levels. At the same time, many view the existing tax system as overly complex and an obstacle to economic growth. These issues have led to some discussion of a value-added tax. Some view a VAT as a possible source of additional revenue to help reduce the deficit and stabilize the debt. Others view a VAT as a means to help improve the competitiveness of the U.S. by providing revenue to permit a reduction in the corporate income tax rate or a reduction in the scope of the income tax system. VATs are the norm in most of the countries. More than 150 countries rely on VATs, and in these countries, VATs account for nearly 1/5 of total government revenue. Consideration of a VAT in the United States is not a new issue. VATs have been discussed and considered in the U.S. for more than 4 decades. A VAT was considered by a task force appointed by President Nixon in 1970 and an advisory panel appointed by President Bush in 2005. A VAT in the U.S. would raise a number of issues, and it can have very different economic effects depending on a number of key considerations. For example, would the VAT be a replacement tax or an add-on tax? Which features of the income tax would be replaced by a replacement VAT? How would the revenue from an add-on VAT be used? Would it be used to reduce the deficit, reform the existing tax system, or fund additional spending? Would the VAT apply broadly to consumption, or would a large portion of household consumption be excluded from the VAT base? Answers to these questions would have a significant impact on the economic effects of a VAT. A broad-based VAT that replaces the worst features of the income tax has the potential to provide significant economic benefits. A VAT is fundamentally a tax on consumption and does not tax the return to saving and investment, thereby reducing the cost of capital and increasing investment. Greater investment means more capital formation and ultimately higher labor productivity and living standards than otherwise would be the case. Estimates suggest that the economic gains from replacing all or a portion of the income tax with a consumption-type tax, such as a VAT, could be significant. One study found that complete replacement of the individual and corporate income taxes could increase the size of the economy in the long run by 6 to 10%. The December 2007 Treasury Department study on approaches to make the U.S. more competitive found that replacement of the corporate income tax with a VAT could increase long-run output by 2% to 2.5%. But it is important to emphasize that these potential economic benefits arise from a VAT that is replacing all or the worst features of the income tax. A deficit-reducing add-on VAT could have significantly different economic effects. Using the revenue from an add-on VAT to reduce the deficit would put downward pressure on long-term interest rates as deficit-financed government spending is replaced with VAT-financed government spending, and deficits that would otherwise crowd out private savings are reduced. Lower long-term interest rates would reduce borrowing costs for both households and businesses and eventually boost output. However, the rise in prices that would accompany an add-on VAT would also likely lower consumer spending, and there is evidence that consumer spending and employment would be permanently reduced. Another key consideration is how broad a VAT base would actually be in practice. The VATs in most other countries and the state sales taxes in the U.S. are generally not broad-based and exclude significant amounts of consumption from the tax base through exemptions and preferential rates. They might be better termed partial VATs. A more narrow base requires a higher tax rate to raise a given amount of revenue and can lead to differential taxation of consumption. Both can reduce the economic benefits of a VAT and adversely affect the sectors of the economy that are taxed. Additionally, an add-on VAT, while possibly addressing the nation's long-term fiscal imbalance, would represent a new tax with additional compliance costs. Businesses would have to collect the VAT on behalf of the government, keep and maintain records of their VAT payments and collection, and prepare VAT returns. The extent of these costs would depend on factors such as the number of transactions involved, the complexity of the VAT base, rate structure, definitions, and administrative enforcement regimes. VATs can also impose extra non-recoverable costs on businesses. Under a VAT, businesses act as tax collectors. A business is liable for VAT on its gross sales but receives credits for VAT previously paid on its purchases. There may be circumstances in which VAT crediting may be incomplete, thereby imposing a direct tax cost on businesses. Because the gross flows are so large, imperfections in the VAT system can be greatly amplified. Finally, the transition as a VAT is introduced would be crucial. Introduction of a VAT involves a lump sum tax on existing assets, plus there could be large near-term macroeconomic effects as the economy adjusts to a large new revenue source. In summary, the specific design of a VAT is critical to its economic effects. All VATs are not equal, and they could have very different economic effects depending on key design elements. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify and look forward to responding to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. Mr. White, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Camp, Ranking Member Levin, and members of the committee, I'm pleased to be here to discuss value-added taxes. Others will discuss the economics of a VAT. I would note in passing, though, that a VAT and a retail sales tax are both consumption taxes. The economics are essentially the same. The administration is different. I will focus on how a VAT is administered, specifically 5 countries' experiences with a VAT: New Zealand, Australia, Canada, France, and the United Kingdom. They represent a range of VAT designs from relatively simple to complex, including some with both national and provincial taxes and some that recently enacted a VAT. I will discuss, 1, how VAT design choices, such as the number of tax rates and exemptions, affect compliance, administrative costs, and taxpayers' compliance burdens; how Canada combined a national VAT with provincial consumption taxes; how countries transition to a VAT; and some possible lessons for the U.S. My main point is that VATs, like income taxes and sales taxes, require a robust administrative presence. I illustrate a simple VAT on page 3 of my statement. Each business in the chain that produces and sells furniture to a consumer owes a VAT of 10% on its sales, but gets a credit for VAT paid on its purchases of inputs. The figure shows how the taxes paid by each company in the chain add up to a VAT of 10% on the price the consumer pays, exactly equivalent to a sales tax of the same rate. In my example, each business is taxed at the same rate. There are no exemptions. However, even such a simple VAT has compliance risks, which I show on page 5. Unscrupulous businesses may not collect VAT owed or may not remit it to the government by, for example, not reporting cash sales or falsely reporting inputs or falsely reporting imports, or they may overclaim credit for tax paid on inputs. Some of these compliance risks, such as underreporting cash, are also problems with an income tax. Others, such as fraudulent refunds, are probably more of an issue with a VAT because, unlike our current income tax, most of these VAT credits are refundable. Under a VAT, large numbers of businesses, such as startups, are legitimately entitled to refunds, making it a challenge to detect refund fraud. In fact, some VAT fraud schemes are common enough to have earned names. One is called carousel fraud because goods move in a circle between countries with tax cheats collecting VAT but not remitting it to the government. Not surprisingly, adding complexity to a VAT through tax preferences increases the challenges of tax administration and loses revenue. France and the United Kingdom built so many exemptions, special rates, and other preferences into their VATs that it's estimated they collect less than half the revenue they could have with a very simple VAT. While all taxes require an administration system, there's some evidence from our study countries that VATs are easier to administer than an income tax. The UK found its VAT cheaper to administer, measured as a percent of revenue collected, than the UK income tax. New Zealand, with a relatively simple VAT, found many fewer errors on VAT returns than on income tax returns. As with other taxes, the VAT compliance burden on taxpayers is mostly driven by record-keeping requirements, the number of times a year returns must be filed, and the time needed to deal with audits. Studies in the UK, Canada, and New Zealand show VAT compliance costs as a percent of sales are greatest for small businesses and much lower for large businesses. For this reason, some countries exempt small businesses from VAT. Interestingly, however, many small businesses in Australia and Canada volunteer to be subject to VAT. Some want credit for taxes paid on their inputs. Some fear being outside the system will cost them customers. Large businesses don't like the extra record keeping required when dealing with exempt businesses. Canada shows how a VAT can work in a federal system. Some provinces adopted a provincial VAT and harmonized it with the federal VAT. Others adopted VATs but with different exemptions and other preferences. Still others kept their provincial sales taxes. Canada shows those different options are workable, but the amount of burden on businesses to comply vary depending on the amount of harmonization. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all introduced their VATs since 1986. All three had the advantage that their VATs replaced pre-existing national consumption taxes. Nevertheless, implementation took up to 2 years, required significant resources for outreach, and the country still had difficulty getting businesses to register for the VAT system before the implementation date. In summary, one lesson about VAT design is that, like our income tax, tax preferences reduce revenue and add complexity, compliance risks, and compliance burden. Having said that, tax design is influenced by criteria in addition to administrability, such as revenue needs, the effect on the economy, and distributional concerns. That concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. Mr. Mitchell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, members of the committee. In my summation of my testimony, I want to focus on what I would call the real world versus the theory, because I agree with the theory that a value-added tax compared to our current income tax is a less destructive way of raising revenue. It doesn't do as much damage per dollar raised. And so in theory, if you replaced or got rid of other taxes, or if you somehow paid down deficits or debt with a value-added tax, you might get some benefits.
But if you look at the experience in Europe and other countries, you find that this is not what happens. And the question that I always pose is, why on earth would we want to copy the fiscal policy of Greece, Portugal, and other countries that are now teetering on the edge of financial collapse? Because what you find in those countries, and I'll walk through some of the data, is that they did not reduce other taxes. They did not lower other tax rates. They did not reduce deficits and debt. Instead, the VAT became, as is sometimes stereotypically referred to, as a money machine or for larger government. Now, a VAT, of course, let's touch on the theory for just a little bit. The shortcut way of understanding a VAT is that it's a system that doesn't allow the deductibility of wages at the business level. You can get into the details on credit invoice subtraction method, but if you find a tax system that doesn't allow deductibility of wages, that's really what a VAT is all about, and it's important to realize what that means. It means that, in effect, you have an entirely additional system for taxing income. Because if you don't allow businesses to deduct the wages and salaries they pay their workers, their employees, in effect, that's a withholding tax that is in addition to, of course, the income tax that they already pay. Now, in the language of public finance economists, the VAT is a consumption tax, but this term requires some elaboration. A consumption or consumption-based tax does not mean necessarily that the tax is actually paid by consumers. It simply means that it's a tax system where there's no double taxation of income that is saved and invested. The Social Security payroll tax is a consumption-based tax since it is not imposed on dividends, interest, and capital gains. Likewise, the flat tax popularized by former House Majority Leader Dick Armey is a consumption tax since dividends, interest, capital gains are not subject to a second layer of tax. In short, a consumption tax is a system where income is taxed only once. It might be taxed only one time when the income is earned. It might be taxed only one time when the income is spent. And this is in contrast to our current system, the Hague-Simons or comprehensive income tax system, which does have pervasive double and triple taxation of income that is saved and invested. Now, because a VAT does not have all this double taxation, it often gets favorable reviews from economists, but that's only if you assume that you're getting rid of other taxes. That's not what anybody is talking about. A VAT is always being discussed as an add-on tax. And what would it mean? Well, if you look at the experience from Europe, you'll see that an add-on value-added tax basically leads to two things. It leads to higher overall tax burdens, and it leads to a higher burden of government spending. If you look at the OECD data, you'll see that government spending in Europe back in the mid-60s, before a VAT became pervasive, was not that different than government spending in the U.S. when measured as a share of GDP. But ever since the VAT was adopted, and of course they've had higher payroll taxes and energy taxes and things like that, so it's not always a one-to-one relationship, but basically you see that government spending has increased dramatically in Europe. But the other thing that you find in Europe since the adoption of a value-added tax is we do not see any improvements in fiscal balance. If anything, deficits and debt have gotten much higher in Europe since the adoption of the value-added tax. In some sense, they're confirming what Milton Friedman said back in the 1990s, is that governments will spend everything that the revenue system will generate, plus as much as they can get away with. You also see, when you're looking at the tax system, one of the big assertions about a value-added tax is that you can use it to reduce or lower other taxes. Well, let's look at what happened in Europe. Let's look at what happened to taxes on income and profits as a share of GDP in Europe. Ever since the VAT was adopted, the tax on income and profits in Europe as a share of GDP has gone up, not down. If we look just at the tax on corporate income as a share of GDP in Europe, you'll see that it's gone up, not down. In the United States, by contrast, we don't have a value-added tax. Our overall tax burden on income and profits has stayed relatively flat over the last 40 or so years, and our tax burden on corporations as a share of GDP has actually fallen. So the assertion that a value-added tax can somehow lead us to a better tax system, it certainly hasn't applied in any countries in the world right now, although I will say some of the more recent countries, like Australia, Japan, that have adopted a VAT or goods and services tax, you don't find the same problems. But I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to make 3 points that have not come out in the discussion so far. First of all, while I support the VAT on efficiency grounds in terms of the ability to raise revenue, as the previous panelists have indicated, and I broadly would agree with the numbers they put forward. I think we should stress that the VAT is an inherently regressive tax. Now, the income distribution in this country has become much more skewed since the tax reform of 1986. These are striking and dramatic numbers, and this is a very hard trend to reverse in many ways. It is certainly possible, as some of the previous panelists said, to address the regressivity of VAT through various forms, some sort of refundable tax credit, and also addressing perhaps Social Security payments. But I would point everyone to the report made by President Bush's advisory panel when they looked carefully at this issue. Even when trying to address this issue, they present numbers that show you the amount of tax being paid at the top of the income distribution goes down dramatically, and the amount of tax being paid in the middle of the income distribution goes up. So I think this is a very serious issue that has to be taken fully on board. The second point is, and I don't think this has been mentioned so far, is that the way financial services are treated in a VAT system has to be viewed carefully. The one problem with the European VAT system is that it has typically, because it's a relatively old system and this problem wasn't sufficiently thought through, it has undertaxed financial services. And the IMF proposed, in the light of the financial crisis and at the behest of the G20, a new form of taxation, which is called rather memorably the FAT, Financial Activities Tax. So we have the VAT and the FAT. I didn't pick the name. It's not my. This is after I left the IMF. But the point of the FAT is to redress this balance. And the latest thinking, although this has not been done fully and properly in any country so far, but it is doable, is to have a version of FAT that would fully integrate with VAT and would result in a fair, equitable taxation on the same basis of financial services. Now, in this context, and completely consistent with the FAT, I would stress that we should also be addressing the excess leverage in the financial system in this country. And I would commend to you a speech made recently by the president of the Minneapolis Fed, Mr. Kocher Lakota, who goes through in detail why the tax code is encouraging excessive leverage for the corporate sector, particularly for the financial sector. This can be addressed at the same time as moving to a VAT plus FAT system. The third point I'd like to make, or the question I think I'd like to raise is, when exactly is the fiscal crisis that we need to address with tax reform? And of course, there are several possibilities. One is a crisis next week, which I certainly hope we will avert. I don't think that's going to happen. We'll see. Another is a crisis over the next 10 years, and that, of course, is part of the discussion around the CBO's forecast window. But the numbers there are quite striking. If the CBO is correct, and there's certainly other projections that we all use, the United States, under reasonable assumptions, will have a small primary surplus at the end of the 10 years. This is not a dramatic budget crisis by any means. There is a budget problem, which has already been mentioned, which is in the longer-term spending, and the IMF also has very good comparative numbers, but this is mostly about increase in medical costs, medical spending over a 30-year period. On this scale, we stand out relative to other countries. So I think the good news part of this is that we have time for proper tax reform. At the same time as we're thinking about tax reform and thinking about the appropriate level and extent of a consumption tax or a VAT plus a financial activities tax, I would stress we need to think about the changing nature of our society over these 30 years. The society is aging in a way that needs the robust provision of public goods, for example, for education and health, for children and for lower income people. We also live in a very dangerous world in which having a robust income base for military spending is absolutely important. One very important feature of these consumption taxes, this is actually mentioned also in the last panel, at least in passing, is that consumption goes down less than does income when you have a major crisis. Now, to the extent that we don't reduce the risks in our financial system, I am very worried about future crises that will damage the receipts from income tax and cause a big increase in debt. The reason why debt has surged over the past 4 years is primarily due to the effects of banks, big banks in particular, blowing themselves up at great cost to the American taxpayer. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We expect a series of votes in about 15 minutes that will last about an hour. So as a result, Mr. Levin and I have yielded back our time, and we're going to go to a 3-minute questioning period. So At this point, Mr. Rangel, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
I just want to ask Mr. Johnson, all the time during this testimony, I was thinking of a possible crisis if the Congress and the President can't get together. Now, Mr. Johnson, I think that there's some people who believe that if we do have a default, that we'll have a smaller government. And I think I read somewhere that you had indicated that a default would increase the size of government. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Rangel, that is my opinion, because government debt as a AAA rated security is the basis of our credit system. So much of the private sector depends on credit one way or another. If you have any kind of government default, and that could be next week, could be at any point, you'll destroy the credit system, you make the private sector smaller, and the government, whatever you think about it, has an ability to operate. You saw this in the Great Depression, even as the private sector crumbles around it. So ironically, one effect, and tragically, I could say, because I certainly don't want default, and I would argue very strongly against anything that would take you down that road, but one ironic effect would be to make the private sector much, much smaller, therefore government as a share of GDP would become bigger while GDP was getting smaller.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rangel. Mr. Davis, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask a hypothetical question, open it up to the panel. If the VAT were imposed, of how wide-ranging should this be if you were to do something like this in the United States? Heard a range of different opinions here. I mean, should some products and services be excluded as they are in the current retail economy from sales tax or professional services? You know, how are you concerned that implementation of a VAT will be no different than our current tax code in terms of complexity, compliance issues that exempt certain income and taxes others? Just like to throw it open to the group there.
That's a very good question, and as I mentioned, the European VATs are quite complex. They've got a lot of exemptions, special rates, other tax preferences or tax expenditures built in, so many that they lose roughly half the revenue that they could have collected from a simpler version. So that the overall point is that just like an income tax, you can add a lot of complexity with exemptions, deductions, special rates, those kinds of tax.
So hypothetically, you could have a simpler VAT with a lower rate and actually make more money.
New Zealand is an example of a country that's got a much simpler VAT, many fewer exemptions, fewer special rates.
Anybody else quickly?
Mr. Davis?
Go ahead. I'll come back to you, Mr. Johnson. We'll get Mr. Gratz and then come back to you briefly.
We've been looking at this very carefully, and the VATs to use as your models are Singapore, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. Talking about Europe is nonsensical because Europe's VATs are ancient, and because of the European treaties, they can't change them without agreement throughout Europe. So Europe is really not the right comparison. These are all modern value-added taxes. They're very broad-based. They're very simple. Their compliance costs are relatively low. Singapore has a very large exemption for small businesses. If I were recommending an exemption for small businesses, I would say that any business under $500,000 of receipts doesn't need to come into the VAT unless it elects to come into the VAT. Some of them will elect to come in because they'll get refunds because of where they are in the chain. I agree with Mr. Johnson, with Professor Johnson, that the financial services problem is a big one. Under many VATs, financial services transactions with businesses are overtaxed, and their transactions with customers, with retail customers, are undertaxed. And we've come up with some solutions that we think will work on that front. These problems of implementation are solvable, and the advantages of having a value-added tax are large. And if we can eliminate a large part of the income tax in the process and get our corporate rate down. You can't solve the corporate income tax problem in this country by tinkering with the international tax rules. It's not going to work.
I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, but the clock has run out on me there. Hopefully someone else will pick up on this.
Mr. Neal is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Alschuler, the relationship of the VAT or proposed VAT and exports, there's a lot of conflicting advice on whether or not the VAT actually would help our exporting industries.
Well, I think, as you know, we economists don't think that the border adjusting a tax will have an effect in the long term on trade. What we think will happen is that there will be exchange rate adjustments that will take away any advantage or disadvantage that we would gain from adopting a border adjustable tax. That said, there will be, it's possible that during a transition period there could be advantages or disadvantages in terms of trade. And if you were to do what I think we would all advise that you should not do and adopt a VAT that has lots of holes and lots of exemptions, you'd create a system in which there would be some disadvantages and advantages in terms of export and import. But again, a reason to adopt the VAT is not because it will be a positive for trade or negative for trade.
An export driver.
Can I make just one quick comment on that, Mr. Neal? Not all exchange rates are moving freely. As we know, China's does not. And exempting exports and taxing imports from a country like that might make a real difference in addition to its other advantages in compliance.
Yeah, I would just add to that, the economic theories would suggest that it's the relative price levels between nations that would adjust for countries where there are flexible exchange rates. That would happen through the flexible exchange rates. For countries with fixed exchange rates or where they're pegged, it would probably happen in other ways, but it would happen much more slowly. There's a lot of inflexibility in labor contracts and so on. So I would agree with Roseanne that it would still happen, but it would happen more slowly. And I would just reiterate one of the points that Roseanne made, that your border adjustments could have significant differential effects if you were to enact a narrow-based VAT, such as they have in Europe, or even as they have at the state level in this country through the kind of the partial sales taxes that are in effect.
Mr. Chairman, given Doha and the fact that we have 3 pending bilateral agreements, I think this would be worth pursuing as we go forward. So I think these panels have been helpful, and I think something along those lines could be more helpful.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Jenkins is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. I think most of us in this room acknowledge that the current tax code's broken. Pro-growth tax system should be simpler, more efficient, fair. Simple tax code is essential, in my belief, to promoting economic efficiency and reducing the interference of taxes with families' everyday business-making decisions. It seems that the layering of a VAT tax, in addition to this already complex personal and business tax, would only produce an ever more burdensome tax code. Instead of promoting widespread economic growth promised by fundamental tax reform, it would promote 2 sectors above all others: accountants and tax lawyers. VAT continues to be highly contentious, and controversies over virtually every aspect of VAT includes a laundry list: the determination of what activities fall within the scope of VAT, the delineation of exempt and zero-related supplies, the characterization of supplies and determination of where they are provided, treatment of composite supplies, apportionment of input taxes to taxable and exempt supplies. As VAT tax isn't immune from controversy, I'd like you all to comment briefly or elaborate on which aspects of VAT tend to invite controversy and litigation, and are there any particular cases that should caution the United States from following other countries in enacting VAT?
Well, I would say 2 things. One is I do think if you have a broad base, these issues are much simpler. New Zealand and those countries, Singapore, are not having great controversy over their value-added taxes. And if you use the revenues from a value-added tax to remove 150 million Americans from the income tax, and you use it to get a 15% rate on income above $100,000 and 25% above $200,000, which is distributionally neutral, and can have a 15% corporate income tax rate, we will have put the United States in a much better position. And I think you'll find that the amounts of money that are being spent by businesses on tax planning and tax advice, and this is the only sector in which the current system creates jobs, is the tax planning, tax return preparation, tax advice sector. And I think a value-added tax, from all experience, if it's used to buy down the income tax significantly, would make a big difference,
Okay.
positive difference.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll
Thank
yield
you.
back.
Ms. Black is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I know that my time is very limited with just 3 minutes, but having just had the presentation prior to you on the fair tax, and what I'd like each of the panelists to do as briefly as you can with a little comment on why you would support or not support the difference between the VAT and the fair tax. So maybe we could start on this end since Mr. Johnson seems to be left out. Mr. Johnson, let's do that and go down.
Yeah, I actually would echo again what President Bush's advisory panel said, which is they came out strongly against fair tax or national sales tax, and they were split, but they were rather more favoring the VAT in terms of how you administer the system, in terms of the compliance risks that you have, in terms of the burden that you have on small business. And of course, in terms of the inherent regressivity and how easy it is to deal with it, you're creating a massive new entitlement plan with the prebates.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you want to do that? We have enough difficulty managing our existing structure.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
If we could repeal the 16th Amendment and put it so deep under the ground that no Supreme Court could possibly let an income tax ever spring up to haunt us again, then either a VAT or some sort of national retail sales tax would be a less destructive way of raising revenue. That's not going to happen, and therefore I hope that we keep a VAT or a national retail sales tax deep under the ground.
Thank you. Mr. White.
As I noted, both the sales tax and a VAT are consumption taxes, so the economics is the same of the two. The administration of them is quite different, so you've got different issues concerning compliance, non-compliance, risks of non-compliance. That would have to be addressed. I would note that with a sales tax, our experience has been with relatively low-rate sales taxes. I don't think around the world there's been any experience with very high-rate sales taxes and the compliance risks there.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll.
I would make the same point. I think one of the two major differences that I would highlight, some of which have already been made. One is the collection of a retail sales tax is focused at the retail level. That makes evasion a much more significant problem, and so that's one area. The second point I would make is that it's probably the case that there'd be much more likely to have base erosion with a retail sales tax than with a value-added tax, that it's much more likely that the experience that we would follow over time would be more typical of what we've seen at the state level, where there's been a very significant erosion of the base by excluding various consumption items. Maybe the third point I would make, it's much more likely we would tax, we would include some intermediate inputs in a sales tax base, but not in a VAT, and that would lead to tax cascading and undermine the efficiency benefits of the sales tax.
Time's running out, Ms. Altschuler.
I'll echo what everybody else said. Well, not what everybody else said, but I was the chief economist for the tax reform panel. We looked closely at the fair tax. We looked fairly at the fair tax. The fair tax is not a fair tax, and it just doesn't work.
All right, thank you. Mr. Herger is recognized for 3 minutes to conclude this session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, and while I feel the consumption part of a tax of the VAT is very admirable, I have some very strong concerns about the lack of transparency and also the fact that it hides the true cost of government from voters. And Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned in your testimony that value-added taxes are typically built into the price of goods and services. Can you elaborate on why this is a problem?
If the tax system is supposed to be the price of government and you want prices to be transparent so voters can understand what they're getting and whether it's worth it, then you want a tax system that's very visible. You don't want it hidden. And we certainly have seen in Europe, I included a chart that I took out of a European Commission report that just was released, showing that just in the last couple of years alone, value-added tax rates have jumped by something like 2 percentage points. And of course, because they're such broad-based taxes, that's a huge increase in the burden on the people of Europe. And one of the reasons why that tax is always so easy to raise is precisely because it's hidden. And one of my concerns is if we put in a VAT at 5 or 10% in the U.S., as we get further and further into this entitlement tsunami, we'll try to keep up with that wave by just raising the VAT rate 1 or 2 percentage points every other year. And of course, we'll make the same mistake that the Europeans made: higher taxes following higher spending, leading to more stagnation, leading to higher deficits and debt. As I said in my oral testimony, I don't want to copy the fiscal policy of countries that are on the verge of collapse. Especially when if we want a single rate consumption-based tax, we already have a Hall-Rabushka system that would be much easier and safer to implement.
Yeah.
Mr. Herger, Canada separately states their value-added tax just like a retail sales tax. There's no reason why in legislation, if you want people to know what they're paying, you just don't have it separately stated, just like a retail sales tax. And Canada's spending has gone down, and its rate actually went down. So, there are ways to control these issues.
I admire what Canada has done. I also remember back in the days when, I'm old enough to remember when you bought gasoline, and they had on the when you filled your tank exactly how many cents of tax you were paying. We don't see that anymore. My concern is future Congresses that will hide it. So therefore, again, I share your concern, Mr. Mitchell. I thank you. It could be right if we had the perfect people in. Regrettably, we more times than not do not have that be the case. But Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for this hearing.
All right, thank you.
to our witnesses.
You've heard the bells. We're having a series of votes. We're having a series of votes on the floor. So I want to thank you all. Members who did not get a chance to question may want to submit some questions to you in writing. If you'd be kind enough to respond to those promptly, we could make those part of the formal hearing record. And I very much appreciate your all being here. This was a very strong panel, and I really appreciate the good information that you brought to the committee. Thank you. This hearing is now adjourned.
Sure.
Yeah, I was wondering
Write
about
us down.
that.
We'll do it again.